She had everything. And in one rain-soaked night, someone decided to take it all away. Valeria Cross, 30 years old, the sharpest billionaire CEO in private aviation, stands in the middle of her own airfield while the sky comes apart above her. Her jet sits dead on the runway. Her empire sits on the edge of a knife. And somewhere in the crowd of engineers and assistants scrambling around her, not a single person has the answer she needs. What she doesn't know yet, what none of them know, is that the answer is standing quietly at the back of the crowd, wearing a grease-stained jacket, saying nothing. Yet. If this story hits you, drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The rain had been falling for 3 hours before anyone admitted the flight wasn't happening. That was the thing about people who worked for Valeria Cross. They were terrified of being the one to tell her no. So they stalled. They ran diagnostics twice, then 3 times. They made phone calls that went nowhere and consulted engineers who contradicted each other and stood around the jet in the punishing October rain like they were performing a ritual instead of solving a problem. Valeria watched all of it from under the narrow overhang of the operations shed, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She had a meeting in Geneva in 14 hours. Not a casual meeting, the kind that determined whether her company, Cross Aero Solutions, remained the dominant force in private aviation infrastructure, or started bleeding contracts to the 3 competitors who'd been circling her like patient wolves for the past 2 years. She had prepared for this trip for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of calls, briefings, legal reviews, 100 small battles fought so that tonight could go smoothly. The jet's engine had shut itself down 11 minutes before scheduled departure. Just stopped. No warning light, no pilot announcement. The aircraft had run through its pre-flight sequence like normal, and then somewhere in those final minutes before wheels up, something inside it had simply quit. A cascade failure, the first engineer told her. Electrical, the second one said. Hydraulic, suggested a third, and by that point Valeria had stopped listening because she understood what was actually happening. They didn't know. None of them knew. And every minute they spent not knowing was a minute she wasn't in the air. Her chief of staff, a wiry 38-year-old named Dennis Fall, appeared at her shoulder holding an umbrella she hadn't asked for. Elgin says it could be the APU, Dennis said. The auxiliary power unit. If there's a fault in... I know what an APU is, Dennis. Right, of course. He adjusted his grip on the umbrella. He's saying we might need to ground the aircraft. Minimum 4 hours to diagnose properly, and that's if the parts are... 4 hours puts me in Geneva at noon. The meeting starts at 9. Yes. So that's not an option. Dennis didn't say anything. That was one of the things Valeria had hired him for, knowing when to shut up. She looked back at the jet. Her jet. A Gulfstream G700, 18 months old, maintained on a schedule so precise that she'd reviewed it personally twice a year. The aircraft had never given her a single problem. It had logged over 400 flight hours without an incident flag, and now it was sitting in the rain like a very expensive piece of modern sculpture. Something was wrong with this picture. She just couldn't see it yet. The airfield itself was private, one of 3 she maintained through her holding company, this one tucked into the industrial edge of the city, about 40 minutes from downtown. It was staffed lean on nights like this, a small ground crew, a fueling team, a security presence. Her flight crew, 2 pilots and a cabin attendant, had been standing near the aircraft for the better part of an hour, getting soaked, getting paid to wait. One of the engineers, a man named Elgin Walsh, who ran her aircraft maintenance division, trudged over from the jet and stopped a few feet away. He was in his mid-50s, broadly built, with the kind of permanent squint that came from too many years staring at engines in bad light. He pulled off one glove and ran a hand over his wet hair. "Valeria," he said. He never called her Ms. Cross. She'd stopped correcting him years ago. "I have to be straight with you. This isn't a clean diagnosis. We're seeing anomalies in the electrical system that don't match any standard failure pattern. The instruments are reading things that shouldn't be reading anything at all." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning the aircraft isn't behaving the way it should when something breaks. It's behaving like..." He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Like something was introduced into the system. An interference." "Elgin. Plain language." He exhaled. "I don't know what's wrong with it, and I've been doing this for 30 years.
I've seen engine failures, software glitches, bird strikes, lightning damage. This doesn't look like any of those things. It looks like something I can't explain yet, and that means I can't clear it to fly. I'm sorry. Valeria held his gaze for a moment. Elgin Walsh was not a man who apologized easily, and he was not a man who admitted uncertainty unless he was genuinely uncertain. She respected him for that, which made it worse. Ground it, she said. She said it quietly, like something being surrendered, and then she turned away before he could see whatever was happening in her face. Behind her, she heard him radio the pilots, heard the collective exhale of a small crowd that had been holding its breath. Dennis started talking about charter alternatives, about commercial options, about whether the Geneva contact could be reached and the meeting rescheduled. She heard all of it and processed none of it because she was watching the rain hit the runway in sheets and thinking about everything that was riding on this trip and how it had just been stripped from her by a machine that didn't have the decency to tell anyone what it had done. That was when she noticed the man in the back. He hadn't been there earlier, or if he had, she hadn't registered him. He was standing at the edge of the tarmac, about 30 feet from the jet, with his arms at his sides and his eyes fixed on the aircraft. Not on the engineers or the commotion or the scrambling, just the aircraft. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, wearing a rain-soaked jacket with a cross arrow patch on the shoulder that identified him as a contract ground technician. He had the kind of stillness that was unusual in a crowd that busy. Everyone else was moving, talking, arguing, pulling out phones and tablets, gesturing at each other. This man was standing completely still, and he was looking at the jet the way a doctor looks at a patient when all the other doctors have missed something. She watched him for a moment. He didn't notice her. He was too focused on the aircraft. Then he tilted his head slightly, like he'd heard something no one else had, and walked forward. "Hey!" One of her security team moved to intercept him. "This area is restricted right now." "I know," the man said. He had a quiet voice, unhurried. "I'm on the ground crew. I just want to look at something. We've got engineers handling it." "I can see that." He glanced at the cluster of men around the aircraft, then back at the jet. "I'd still like to look at something." Valeria spoke before she knew she was going to. "Let him through." Her security man looked at her. She nodded once. He stepped aside and the man in the grease-stained jacket walked forward toward the aircraft with his hands in his pockets. She followed. She wasn't sure why. She told herself it was because she had nothing better to do in the next few minutes and she wasn't ready to go inside yet, and both of those things were true. But there was something else. Some instinct she'd learned to trust over 10 years of building a company from scratch. A kind of frequency she'd developed for recognizing when someone in a room knew more than they were letting on. He stopped near the front landing gear, crouched down, looked up at the undercarriage of the aircraft for a long moment without touching anything. Elgin Walsh noticed him and walked over. "Who are you?" "Rowan Hale," the man said, still looking at the undercarriage. "I'm on the third shift ground rotation. I was finishing a service check on the fuel truck when everything started." "And what are you doing?" "Looking." He stood up and moved around the nose of the aircraft, running his eyes along the fuselage without touching it, slow and methodical, like he was reading something written in a language everyone else had forgotten. "The APU theory doesn't hold up." Elgin stiffened. "Excuse me?" "If it was an APU fault, you'd see a consistent voltage drop across the secondary bus." Rowan didn't look at him. "You're not seeing that, are you? You're seeing irregular surges. Inconsistent. Different parts of the system losing and regaining partial power at different times." A beat of silence. "That's correct," Elgin said carefully. "So it's not the APU." Rowan crouched again, this time near the access panel on the left side of the fuselage, just forward of the wing root. He looked at the seam of the panel without touching it. Then he looked at the hinge hardware. Then he was quiet for a moment. "Can someone get me a flashlight?" Nobody moved immediately. People glanced at each other. Valeria, standing a few feet back, watching this, said, "Get him a flashlight," to no one in particular, and within 10 seconds one materialized from someone's kit. Rowan took it, clicked it on, and shone it directly at the gap around the access panel. He leaned close, said nothing for nearly a full minute, then, "This panel was opened recently." "Of course it was," Elgin said.
It gets serviced on a not regularly opened, recently. Rowan turned the light at a specific angle. The sealant on this edge has been disturbed. See the compression pattern? That's not wear, that's acute pressure. Someone pushing this open and closing it again without doing a proper reseal. And the fastener on the lower right corner has a different oxidation pattern than the others. It was replaced. Elgin stepped forward, bent down, looked at where the light was pointing. Something shifted in his expression. The fastener, Rowan said quietly, is not the same manufacturer as the other three. Different thread grade. Someone put in a substitute. He stood up, turned off the flashlight, looked at Elgin, then at Valeria. I don't want to overstep, he said, but this doesn't look like a mechanical failure to me. The rain was loud on the tarmac. Nobody said anything. Valeria took a step forward. Say the rest of it. He looked at her directly for the first time. He had gray eyes, tired around the edges, and he held her gaze without performance or calculation, just straightforwardly, like someone who'd already made peace with saying the uncomfortable thing. It looks like someone got into this panel, he said, and whatever they did in there is what's causing your electrical anomalies. The failure pattern isn't random, and it isn't organic. He paused, like he was measuring the word before he used it. It's designed. The word landed like something dropped on concrete. Designed. Valeria heard Elgin draw a slow breath. She heard Dennis behind her stop mid-sentence about charter alternatives. She heard the rain and the distant sound of the airfield perimeter and the blood moving in her own ears. You're saying sabotage, she said. I'm saying it needs to be investigated as sabotage, Rowan said. I'm a mechanic. That's not my call to make. He handed the flashlight back to whoever had given it to him. But you asked me to say the rest of it. She had asked him. She'd told him to. She turned to Elgin. Don't touch that panel. Don't let anyone touch it. Then to Dennis. Call Marcus Chen tonight. I don't care what time it is. Marcus Chen was the head of her internal security division, and he had worked corporate investigations before coming to her 4 years ago. And when she called him at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in the rain, he answered on the second ring, which was why she paid him what she paid him. I need you at the Cresthaven airfield, she said. Right now. Bring the technical team. What happened? My jet was grounded tonight. Someone may have helped it along. A pause. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She ended the call, looked at the jet, looked at Rowan Hale, who was standing off to one side now, hands back in his jacket pockets, not trying to insert himself into anything, not waiting to be thanked. Don't go anywhere, she said to him. I wasn't planning to, he said. So the next 40 minutes were the kind that stretched. Valeria went inside the operations shed mostly because Dennis kept hovering near her in a way that communicated, wordlessly but aggressively, that she was going to get pneumonia if she didn't. She stood near the window where she could see the jet and drank a cup of terrible coffee from a machine in the corner that tasted like it had been filtering the same ground since 2019. She thought about the Geneva meeting. She thought about who knew about the Geneva meeting. That list was not short. It had been on the internal schedule for 6 weeks, which meant it had passed through at least a dozen people. Her executive assistant, her legal team, the board members she'd briefed, the pilots, the operations coordinator who managed the airfield schedule. It had been discussed in at least 3 leadership meetings in the past month. Anyone in her building could have known. The thought sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She'd built Cross Arrow from the ground up. She'd started with one regional maintenance contract when she was 22 years old, barely out of a business program she'd half-financed herself, working with a team of 4 people in a leased space that flooded every time it rained hard. She'd grown it through sheer relentless grinding, picking up contracts nobody else wanted, delivering results nobody else expected, reinvesting every cent back into the company until it had enough momentum to sustain itself. By the time she was 26, she had 80 employees. By 28, 240. By 30, Cross Arrow Solutions was a $360 million operation with offices in 4 cities and a roster of clients that included some of the largest private aviation operators in the country. She had done it by trusting people, selectively, carefully, but genuinely. She'd built a culture that she believed in. She paid people well. She listened when they pushed back. She promoted from within whenever she could. She had given pieces of her company to people she'd watched grow from junior roles, people she'd mentored personally. One of them, apparently, had used that access to try and knock her down. She drank the terrible coffee and stared at the rain on the window and tried to think clearly about who had that kind of motive and that kind of access simultaneously. It was a specific intersection. Motive without access was nothing. Access without motive was irrelevant. The overlap, that was where this person lived. She made herself stop because Marcus wasn't here yet, and there was no point spiraling through suspects before she had any real information. Rowan Hale was sitting on a plastic chair near the door. He had a cup of coffee too, and he was looking at the floor in the relaxed but alert way of someone comfortable with waiting. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't talking to anyone. "You've worked for this company how long?" Valeria asked. He looked up. 8 months. Contract through Meridian Aviation Services. Before that? Air National Guard maintenance, 4 years. Before that, 2 years with a commercial carrier. He paused. Before that, I was 22 and didn't know what I was doing. A ghost of something crossed his face when he said the last part. Not embarrassment, more like a quick acknowledgement of a version of himself he'd moved past. Valeria had interviewed hundreds of people in her life, and she'd gotten decent at reading the gap between what people said and what they meant. There wasn't much of a gap with this man. "How did you know about the oxidation pattern?" she asked. "On the fastener. I've spent a lot of time with aircraft hardware. You see enough of it, you start to notice when something's off." He tilted his head slightly. "Also, that access panel is in a location that's not on any routine maintenance schedule for a Gulfstream G700. There's no reason to be in there unless you know what you're looking for. So when I saw signs of recent disturbance in a place that shouldn't have been disturbed, I paid attention. Most people wouldn't have looked there at all. Most people were looking at the symptoms," he said, "not the aircraft." It was a simple distinction, but it cut to something real. Valeria had watched 6 or 7 experienced engineers cluster around the jet for the better part of an hour, running every diagnostic they could think of, and none of them had thought to step back and look at the physical aircraft with fresh eyes. They'd all been so deep in the data that they'd missed what was directly in front of them. She filed that away. She filed most things away. "Do you have a daughter?" she asked. It was a strange question to ask, and she wasn't sure what had prompted it. He looked mildly surprised by it too, but he answered without hesitation. "Yeah, Maya. She's 6. A small, involuntary softening in his face. "She's with my neighbor tonight." "You're a single father?" "Her mother left when Maya was 2. He said it plainly, without edge. "It's fine, we work it out." Valeria nodded. She didn't follow up because there was something in the way he'd said "we work it out" that wasn't asking for anything, and she'd learned over the years that people who weren't asking for anything usually meant it. The door opened and Marcus Chen came in with 2 members of his technical team, all of them damp and serious. Marcus was 41, compact, with a stillness about him that reminded Valeria oddly of Rowan. The same quality of someone who processed things internally before saying them out loud. "Show me the aircraft," Marcus said. "Talk to him first." Valeria nodded toward Rowan. "He's the one who found it." Marcus looked at Rowan. Rowan stood up, put down his coffee, and walked them through everything he'd observed. Calmly, precisely, without drama or embellishment. He used specific terminology where he had it, and plain language where he didn't, and he was careful to distinguish between what he had observed and what he was inferring from the observation. Marcus asked 3 follow-up questions. His technical team members exchanged a look. Then Marcus looked at Valeria. "Let's go look at the aircraft." But they spent 2 hours on the aircraft. Valeria stood outside during most of it, under the overhang again, this time with a borrowed jacket over her shoulders, because it was getting cold and Dennis had actually physically placed the jacket on her in a way that brooked no argument. She watched the lights moving inside the operations shed, watched Marcus's team work, watched the rain slowly ease into a fine mist that blurred the runway lights into soft halos. At 1:15 in the morning, Marcus came and stood beside her. "He was right," he said, without preamble, because Marcus didn't do preamble when the information was serious. "The access panel on the left fuselage forward of the wing root. Someone got in there. We found a device. Small, professionally installed, designed to create intermittent interference in the electrical management system. It wouldn't have caused a crash. It's not that kind of device. It would cause exactly what happened: a convincing, difficult-to-diagnose cascade of anomalies that would ground the aircraft without any single obvious point of failure. Valeria listened to this, felt it move through her body. Whoever installed it, Marcus continued, knew aircraft systems. This wasn't an amateur, and they knew your maintenance schedule well enough to work around it. They accessed a point in the aircraft that wouldn't be flagged in any routine check. So they had inside knowledge. Almost certainly. He paused. There's something else. The device has a timer component. It was set to activate during the pre-flight sequence. That means whoever installed it knew your departure window. They knew approximately when you were leaving tonight. The departure window, which had been logged in her internal scheduling system, which was accessible to... She didn't want to count the number of people it was accessible to. How long has the device been in there, she asked. We'll know more when we get it to the lab, but based on the installation condition, I'd estimate between 48 and 72 hours, maybe longer. 3 days? Possibly more. Her jet had been sitting at this airfield, carrying this thing inside it, while she'd gone about her week normally. Her meetings, her calls, her 6 weeks of preparation for a trip that someone had already planned to destroy. I need access records, she said. Everyone who came through this airfield in the past week, every maintenance log, every entry point, every camera. Already on it. Marcus pulled out a tablet. There's also something you should see. He pulled up a camera feed, the airfield's perimeter security from 3 nights ago. The image was grainy in the rain, but clear enough. A figure moving along the aircraft, unhurried, wearing a maintenance uniform. Stopping at the access panel. Working for approximately 11 minutes. Moving away. The figure's face was never fully visible, but the build, the gait. There was something familiar in it. Something that nagged at the back of Valeria's recognition before she could place it. Can you clean this up? She asked. Working on it? She handed the tablet back, looked at the aircraft. The device was out now, bagged and tagged, and Marcus's team was documenting every inch of the area around the panel. The jet would be impounded for the investigation. The Geneva meeting was gone. Everything she'd built toward for 6 weeks was sitting in a pile of wreckage. She thought, briefly, about whoever had done this. What they had anticipated. They'd anticipated exactly this. Her standing on this tarmac, the trip canceled, her position weakened at precisely the moment it needed to be strong. They'd picked their timing deliberately. The Geneva meeting wasn't just important in itself. A canceled Geneva meeting sent a message to everyone watching her company. It said something was wrong. It invited questions, doubts, the circling wolves to circle a little closer. Whoever had done this understood her operation from the inside. They understood what Geneva meant and why it mattered, and what its absence would communicate to the market. That wasn't a competitor. That was someone who knew her. Boom. Rowan Hale was still there at 2 a.m. He hadn't been asked to stay. No one had technically asked him to stay, and his shift had ended hours ago. But he was sitting on the same plastic chair, awake, when Valeria came back inside. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. You should go home, she said. Your daughter. Neighbor said she'd stay over. It's fine. He paused. How bad is it? It was an odd question in a way. He was a contract ground technician, and the scope of what was unfolding was well beyond his professional concern. But she found she didn't resent it. There was nothing acquisitive in the way he'd asked, no attempt to position himself as central to what was happening. It was just a direct question from someone who'd been present for the beginning of this and wanted to understand where it had gone. Bad enough, she said. They found a device. Marcus's assessment is it was professionally installed by someone with inside access to my operation. He absorbed that. I'm sorry. Don't be. You found it. That matters more than... She stopped, reformulated. If we'd gotten in the air tonight, the pilots would have been dealing with those anomalies in flight, over the Atlantic. She didn't let herself dwell on what that might have meant. So don't be sorry, that was the right call. I just looked at the plane, he said. I know, that's the point. She sat down, not next to him exactly, but in the same row of plastic chairs, 2 seats over,
because she was genuinely tired, and her heels were killing her, and the borrowed jacket smelled like motor oil, and she was past the point of maintaining the posture of a CEO in front of a contract mechanic. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure, but why didn't you say anything earlier? When all the engineers were standing around the jet, you were there for some of that. Why wait?" He considered this. "I didn't know anything yet. I had a feeling, looking at the aircraft from a distance, that something was off. But a feeling isn't a finding. I needed to be closer before I said anything." Most people would have said something anyway, something to get noticed. "I'm not trying to get noticed," he said, like the concept was slightly foreign to him. "I just wanted to know if I was right." Valeria looked at him. In her world, the world she'd inhabited for the past 10 years, the people around her were almost universally trying to get noticed in one way or another. She'd learned to work with that, had even learned to use it, to give people the visibility they needed in exchange for the results she needed. It was a transactional ecology, and she'd gotten very good at navigating it. This man did not appear to be operating within that ecology at all. He'd found something important, helped confirm it, and was now sitting in a plastic chair at 2 a.m, waiting for nothing in particular. "You understand this is bigger than what happened tonight," she said. "Finding that device opens an investigation into my company, into people who work for me, people I've trusted." She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't smooth it. "Someone I know tried to ground me, literally, and I think figuratively." "Yeah," Rowan said. "I figured it was something like that." "That doesn't scare you, being in the middle of something like that?" He thought about it. "I've been scared by harder things." She didn't ask what they were. It wasn't the time and it wasn't her business, and there was something about the way he said it that implied the answer was real and private in equal measure. "Go home to your daughter," she said. "Marcus will need a statement from you tomorrow. I'll have Dennis reach out with the time." He nodded and stood up, pulling his jacket back on. At the door he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "I hope you find out who did it." "I will," she said. She said it without hesitation, without bravado. Just flat and certain, the way she'd always said the things she intended to make true. He left. The door closed behind him. She sat in the empty operations shed, in a borrowed jacket that smelled like motor oil, listening to the rain that had softened to almost nothing, and she began working through the list. Motive, access, timing. 3 variables, 1 intersection. She would find it. She would find the person who had stood on her airfield 3 nights ago and worked for 11 minutes on her aircraft in the dark. She would pull the thread until everything attached to it came loose. But somewhere behind the anger, behind the cold calculation of what needed to happen next, there was something else, a quieter, more unsettling recognition. She had hundreds of employees, dozens of senior people. She had spent years building something she believed in, and all of it had layers she apparently hadn't seen. She'd looked at her company the same way her engineers had looked at that aircraft tonight, focused on the outputs, the data, the performance metrics, the things she could measure, and she'd missed something hiding just beneath the surface. Someone had gotten in through a panel she'd never thought to check. She was going to have to start looking at the whole aircraft. She didn't sleep that night. That wasn't unusual. Valeria had a complicated relationship with sleep under normal circumstances, and these were not normal circumstances. But this particular sleeplessness had a different quality to it. Most nights when she couldn't sleep, her mind was running through problems with a productive kind of restlessness, the kind that occasionally produced solutions at 3 a.m. that she'd write in the Notes app on her phone and find waiting for her at 6. This night was different. This night her mind kept circling back to the same image, a figure on the airfield security camera, moving along the side of her aircraft in the dark, unhurried, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how much time they had. 11 minutes. That was all it had taken. She was back in her apartment by 4 a.m, still in the same clothes, the borrowed jacket left behind in the operations shed. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a glass of water she kept forgetting to drink, and began pulling up everything she could access from her company's internal records system. Maintenance logs for the past 30 days, access records for the Cresthaven airfield, the departure schedule that had been distributed internally for the Geneva trip. The access records were incomplete. Not obviously incomplete,
Not in a way that would have stood out to anyone not specifically looking for gaps. But she'd spent enough time inside her own systems to know what complete looked like. And this wasn't it. 3 entries from the relevant 48-hour window were logged with generic employee ID codes that weren't tied to specific names in the system. That happened sometimes. Contractor badges, temporary access passes issued for specific tasks that didn't always propagate cleanly through the logging software. She'd known about the gap in the logging system for years, had been told it was a low-priority fix, had accepted that assessment without pushing back. She added that to the list of things she should have pushed back on. At 5:30, she sent Marcus a message. Check the contractor badge system. Someone may have used a temporary access code. I want to know who issued it and to whom. His reply came 8 minutes later, which meant he hadn't slept either. Already on it. Also found something in the maintenance records you need to see. Can you come in at 8? She could come in at 8. She showered, changed, made coffee that was substantially better than the machine in the operations shed, and sat with it at the window while the city woke up around her in the gray October morning. She thought about Geneva. She thought about the board member she'd been scheduled to present to, a man named Hargrove, who had been skeptical of her last acquisition and would now have 6 additional weeks to cultivate that skepticism before she could address it in person. She thought about what a canceled trip communicated to the institutional investors who watched Cross Arrow's moves with the close attention of people whose money was tied to her judgment. Then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it wasn't going to change any of it, and she needed to be clear-headed in 3 hours. She thought instead about Rowan Hale. She wasn't entirely sure why. He'd done something important and he'd done it quietly. And then he'd gone home. And in the normal course of events, she'd have sent him a formal acknowledgement, perhaps a bonus processed through his contracting agency, and filed the interaction away as a useful footnote to a difficult night. That was the efficient response. That was how she'd handled comparable situations before. But there was something about the way he'd said, I just wanted to know if I was right, that stuck in her. Not the statement itself, the absence of anything underneath it. No calculation, no angling for credit. Just a man who had looked at something, formed a hypothesis, and needed to verify it. The outcome, the investigation it opened, the fact that it had potentially saved lives, the gratitude of a billionaire CEO, seemed almost incidental to him. She had been surrounded for years by people who performed competence, who made sure their competence was visible, attributable, legible to the people who controlled their careers. She'd done it herself early on, had been very deliberate about making sure the right people saw what she could do. That was just practical. That was how careers moved. Rowan Hale seemed to have skipped that module entirely. She made a second cup of coffee, which was probably a mistake, and went to get ready for the day. Marcus Chen's office was on the 14th floor of the Cross Arrow headquarters building downtown, tucked into a corner in a way that felt deliberately inconspicuous for someone with his authority level. He'd decorated it minimally: a desk, a conference table, a whiteboard that was always covered in things Valeria was never sure she was meant to see. When she came in at 8:15, he was standing at the whiteboard with a dry erase marker, and there were already 4 names written on it. She sat down without being invited to. He turned from the board. The maintenance records, he said without preamble. Your jet was in for a routine avionics inspection 9 days ago. Standard scheduled service, nothing unusual. 3 technicians logged on that service order. All 3 have been with the company or with approved contractors for more than 2 years. Clean records. But the service order was amended 12 hours after it was closed. Someone added a 4th line item. A secondary inspection of the electrical management interface. That addition was logged under a supervisory override code. Valeria was quiet for a moment. Supervisory override codes are issued to division managers and above, yes. He picked up a tablet. The specific code used was assigned to the manager of your aircraft operations division. Griffin Lowell. Griffin Lowell. Marcus said the name carefully, like he was aware of its weight. The code was used at 11:42 p.m. on the night 9 days ago, 4 hours after the service team had logged off. There would have been no one in the hangar at that time. Valeria sat with that. Griffin Lowell was 44 years old, had been with Cross Arrow for 7 years, had been promoted to his current role 3 years ago on her direct recommendation. He ran a division of 60 people. He'd been in the room for almost every major operational decision she'd made in the past 3 years. Is it possible someone else used his code? She asked. Not because she believed it, but because she needed to eliminate it. Possible. Not likely. The code requires a biometric secondary confirmation, fingerprint. The system logged a successful biometric match. So it was him or someone with his fingerprint. Effectively him, Marcus said. She stood up and walked to the window. Looked at the street 14 floors down, the early morning traffic, a woman walking a dog that kept stopping to investigate something in the gutter. Griffin Lowell. She'd given him a car when his daughter was born. She'd moved his entire team to better office space 18 months ago because he'd told her morale was suffering. She'd gone to his division's Christmas party 2 years running because she believed in showing up for her people. She'd stood at the Geneva briefing 3 weeks ago while he sat across the table and asked smart, engaged questions about the client relationship strategy. He'd taken notes. He'd offered 2 suggestions she'd actually incorporated. What else? She said, still looking at the window. Camera footage from the Cresthaven airfield. He pulled it up on the conference room screen. The same clip she'd seen the night before, but cleaned up. Better resolution. The image stabilized. The figure was clearer now, and the gait, the particular way the person held their left shoulder slightly lower than their right, which was a thing you noticed once you knew to look for it. She'd been right that it was familiar. We can't get a face confirmation, Marcus said. But there's a physical profile match, and the shoulder asymmetry is consistent with a rotator cuff injury. I checked HR records. He paused. Griffin Lowell filed a workers' compensation claim for a rotator cuff injury 4 years ago. The room was quiet. I need to know his motive, Valeria said. I need to understand what he thought this was going to get him. We're looking at that too. Marcus set down the tablet. There's a board meeting scheduled in 3 weeks. There have been conversations among certain board members about the leadership structure of the company, whether the current setup is optimal. He said it with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they personally found distasteful. Your name specifically was part of those conversations. There are at least 2 board members who have been receptive to the idea of a leadership review. She turned from the window. Who? Hargrove and Dessa Kimball. Dessa Kimball, who had been on her board for 2 years, who had championed the idea of external strategic oversight, who had never made her hostility particularly secret, but had also never done anything overt enough to address directly. And Hargrove, whose skepticism about the last acquisition had apparently curdled into something more active. So the theory, she said, is that Griffin was working with board members to create a situation, a canceled major trip, a visible failure of operational control, that would support a push to remove me or restructure my authority before the board meeting. It's a theory, Marcus said. We don't have direct evidence of coordination with the board members yet. What we have is Griffin's access code on the maintenance record, a physical profile match on the camera, and a device installed in your aircraft that was designed to cause exactly the kind of visible failure that would benefit people who want to challenge your position. It's enough, she said. Keep pulling. I want communication records, his company email, his calendar, anything he put through internal systems in the past 60 days. I want to know who he talked to. Some of that requires legal sign-off. Get legal on the phone. Now, Marcus, not this afternoon. He was already reaching for his phone. She was already at the door. She had a company to run. She had a crisis to manage. And she had a person she'd trusted and promoted and respected who had apparently spent some portion of his last 3 years building the architecture of her downfall while sitting across conference tables from her and taking notes. She was going to deal with all of it. But right now she had to go be a CEO, because if she stopped doing that for even a day, the wolves would have something real to point at. The morning was a controlled disaster. The canceled Geneva trip had to be explained. Not the real explanation, not yet, but something credible and specific enough that it didn't invite speculation. Valeria worked with her communications team on a statement about a technical issue with the aircraft under investigation, which was true in the narrow sense, and she reached out personally to the Geneva contact to begin rebuilding the meeting in whatever form it could take. Video call wasn't the same as sitting across a table from someone, but it was something, and she was very good at video calls. She had her executive team in a meeting by 9. Not to tell them about the investigation, Marcus had been explicit that internal containment was critical right now. But to manage the flow of the day, to make sure the 100 ordinary decisions that kept the company moving got made, she sat at the head of the conference table and ran through agenda items and made decisions and listened to the operational update from her division heads. And she watched Griffin Lowell sit 3 seats down from her and speak when spoken to and take notes on his tablet. He had no idea that she knew. That was a strange thing to hold in your body. She'd had difficult conversations before, had delivered bad news, had fired people, had navigated conflicts that got ugly, but she'd never sat across from someone while knowing something like this. While looking at a person who had stood in the dark on her airfield and worked for 11 minutes to unravel her, and then come to work the next morning and sat in her meeting with his tablet and his notes. She held it. She filed it. She kept her voice completely normal. After the meeting, as people were filing out, Griffin paused near the door. "Valeria, I heard about last night. The aircraft." He had his concerned face on, practiced and credible. "Are you okay? That must have been a rough few hours." She looked at him, 1 full second of looking, during which she made a decision she'd been building towards since Marcus had said his name that morning. "It was," she said. "We're handling it." "Thanks, Griffin." He nodded and left. She sat in the empty conference room for a moment and breathed. The hardest part of the next few days, she understood, was going to be exactly this: the performance of normalcy, while the investigation moved quietly in the background. She couldn't confront Griffin directly, not until Marcus had built enough of an evidentiary record to make the confrontation stick legally. If she moved too early, he'd have time to manage his exposure, to build a narrative, to bring whatever board-level allies he had to his defense. She needed to wait. She needed to act like nothing had changed. She was good at performing normalcy. She'd been doing it her entire life in one form or another. But this particular version, performing normalcy for a specific person while knowing what she knew, sat in her stomach like something undigested. By midday, she'd fielded calls from 2 journalists who'd somehow gotten wind of the grounded jet, not the sabotage, just the grounding, that was still contained, a board member checking in who she could not yet tell whether was calling from loyalty or from surveillance, and her mother, who had seen a vague social media post from someone at the airfield and wanted to know what was going on. That call she took in her office with the door closed, sitting with her back to her desk, looking at the far wall. "I'm fine, Mom." "You don't sound fine." "I'm handling a situation. The aircraft had a technical issue. It's being investigated." "Was it dangerous? Were you in danger?" She thought about the aircraft running through its pre-flight sequence, the timer activating, the device doing its work. She thought about what could have happened at altitude over open water if the failure had been different, if someone had been a little less careful about the specific kind of failure they wanted to create. "I wasn't in danger," she said. "The plane was grounded before I got on it." "Who grounds a plane worth that much on a night when you have to be somewhere?" "Someone did their job correctly," Valeria said. And then, because her mother wouldn't understand the specific weight of that, someone noticed something was wrong before it could become a real problem. That's all. After she ended the call, she sat for another minute in the empty office. She thought about Rowan in the rain, crouching by the access panel, shining his flashlight at a fastener that didn't belong. She thought about how close it had been. Not close in the dramatic way of movies, but close in the quieter, more vertiginous way of real life, where disasters don't announce themselves, and the moments that stop them don't look heroic from the outside. Dennis appeared in her doorway. "Rowan Hale is here, for the statement Marcus requested. Tell Marcus's team he's here. They're ready for him. I just thought you'd want to know." She considered for a moment. "Give me 5 minutes first." Dennis retreated. She stood, straightened her jacket, and went down the hall to the small conference room where Rowan was waiting. He was sitting in a chair facing the door, hands on the table, looking at the wall with the patient stillness she was already starting to associate with him. When she came in, he started to stand and she waved him back down. "You don't have to do that," she said, and sat across from him. He looked rested, which she found faintly annoying given that she wasn't. He changed clothes, a plain dark jacket, a gray shirt, jeans that had seen a lot of use. He looked like a man who had somewhere better to be but wasn't making that anyone's problem. "How's your daughter?" she asked. He blinked, like he hadn't expected that to be the opening. "Good. She made me pancakes this morning."
A slight pause. They were shaped like dinosaurs. She has a mold.
How'd they taste? Like she put in twice the amount of vanilla extract the recipe called for, but she was proud of them so. He lifted one shoulder slightly. Valeria found herself almost smiling, which was the first time that had happened in about 12 hours. I wanted to tell you before Marcus's team gets into the formal statement. What you found last night was significant. More significant than we knew in the moment. He watched her, waiting for the rest. They confirmed the device. They also have leads on how it got there and who was responsible. She kept it deliberately vague. Marcus had been clear about containment. The investigation is active, but I wanted you to understand that what you did wasn't a small thing. I looked at the plane, he said again. Stop doing that. He tilted his head. Stop minimizing it, she said. You looked at the plane when everyone else was looking at the instruments. That's not a small distinction. That's the whole thing. He was quiet for a moment, then, it's just how I look at problems. Work backward from the physical reality. The instruments tell you what the system is reporting. The aircraft tells you what actually happened. Where did you learn that? My father, he said. Without elaboration, and with that same quality she'd noticed the night before, real and private in equal measure. She let it sit. Marcus's team will take your statement, she said. It'll take about an hour, probably. Is that okay? That's fine. Maya's at school. He paused. Is there anything specific I should... Just tell them exactly what you told me, what you observed, what you inferred, in that order. She stood. Don't add anything. Don't speculate beyond what you actually saw. Your observation is the foundation. The rest is the investigation's job. He nodded. She was at the door when he spoke. Miss Cross. She turned. I hope you slept, he said. You look like you didn't. It was such a blunt and slightly inappropriate thing to say to your employer's employer that she almost laughed out loud. And the almost laugh felt like something releasing in her chest that she'd been holding since 4 a.m. I didn't, she said. Neither did I, he admitted. I kept thinking about the oxidation pattern on that fastener, whether I'd called it right. You called it right, he exhaled. Good. And he said it with such plain, uncomplicated relief. Not pride, not satisfaction, just relief that he'd been right. That she had to turn away before something in her face gave away how completely disarmed she was by a man who had potentially saved her life and was primarily worried about whether he'd read the hardware correctly. She went back to her office. She had 16 things on her calendar, a company to run, and an investigation to quietly oversee without tipping off the man 3 seats down from her in every meeting. She handled all of it. That was what she did. By 4 p.m, Marcus had sent her a summary document flagged urgent. She read it in her office with the door locked. The communication records were starting to come in. The legal team had authorized access to Griffin Lowell's company email and internal messaging accounts under the emergency provisions in his employment agreement, the ones that allowed security review in cases of suspected breach. What they found in the first 6 weeks of records was not a smoking gun. Griffin was smart enough not to be explicit, but it was a pattern of contacts that built something unmistakable when you laid it out in sequence. 43 messages to Dessa Kimball in the past 60 days. Some of them were normal. Board communications were part of Griffin's role in limited contexts, but 17 of those messages were sent through his personal email address to her personal email address, which was not part of any normal board communication protocol. The content of those messages was not yet accessible. They'd need a different legal process for personal accounts. But the fact of them, the frequency, the channel, told its own story. There were also calendar entries. A lunch off campus 3 weeks ago. A coffee meeting 6 weeks ago. Both with a notation in Griffin's calendar that read simply DK, and both in the window leading up to the Geneva scheduling. Valeria sat with this and felt the full shape of it settle into place. Dessa Kimball had been maneuvering for months. Board conversations, pointed questions about leadership structure, the skepticism that had never quite risen to the level of a formal challenge, but had always been present as a kind of atmospheric pressure. And Griffin, who had been passed over once for a promotion Valeria had given to someone else, who had smiled when she told him and said he understood, who had continued to perform his role with complete professionalism, Griffin had decided to help Dessa apply that pressure in a way that had real teeth. They'd picked the Geneva trip deliberately. They must have known what it meant, what a canceled meeting with that particular partner at that particular moment would signal. They'd planned the timing, secured the access, installed the device, and then Griffin had walked into the briefing meeting and asked smart, engaged questions and taken notes. She thought about all the times she'd looked across a table at him and read his expression as loyalty, as investment, as the kind of genuine professional engagement that made working with good people worthwhile. She thought about what she'd missed. Then she stopped, because dwelling on what she'd missed wasn't going to help her right now, and she needed to focus on what came next. She called Marcus. He picked up immediately. "How long until we have enough for a formal confrontation?" she asked. "If the personal email records come through the way I expect them to." 2 days. Maybe 3. He paused. "You're going to need employment counsel in the room, and you're going to need to think carefully about timing relative to the board meeting." "I know," she thought. The board meeting was 3 weeks out. A confrontation with Griffin before she had complete documentation risked a messy public dispute that could itself be weaponized. A confrontation after the board meeting, if Dessa and Griffin had already begun building their case with other board members, was too late. "I need to neutralize the board angle before the confrontation. I need to have conversations with the members who aren't in this before Griffin has a chance to shape their perception of what's happening." "That's a political move," Marcus said. "I can give you the security angle. The board politics is yours." "I know." She looked at her calendar. 3 board members she trusted, genuinely, with the kind of trust that had actually been tested over time rather than assumed from proximity. She needed to talk to all 3 of them, carefully, without triggering panic or premature disclosure. "I'll handle it." She ended the call, sat for a moment. Then she thought of something and called Dennis. Rowan Hale's statement. Did Marcus's team get everything they needed? He finished about an hour ago. They said it was thorough. Good. Find out what his contracting arrangement looks like through Meridian. I want to know what his rate is, what his current assignment is, and what the terms of extending or modifying that arrangement would be. Dennis paused for a fraction of a second. Any particular reason? "I'm thinking about his role in the investigation going forward," she said, which was partially true. "I want to know what we're working with." After she ended that call, she sat at her desk for a moment and looked at nothing in particular and acknowledged to herself, with the kind of honesty she mostly reserved for 4 in the morning, that she was also just thinking about the man who had crouched on a wet tarmac in the dark and noticed a fastener that didn't belong, and had waited until he was sure before he said anything, and had come in the next morning and worried about whether he'd read the oxidation pattern correctly. In a week that had comprehensively demolished her faith in people she'd chosen to trust, that was worth thinking about. The evening came early, the way it did in late October, and the city outside her window switched from gray daylight to orange-lit dark while she was still working through her inbox. She stayed at her desk until 8, then drove home through quiet streets, ate something she barely tasted, and sat on her couch in the silence of her apartment. The investigation was moving, the evidence was building. In 2 or 3 days, Marcus would have enough, and she would have the conversation she needed to have with her board, and then she would sit across from Griffin Lowell and watch him understand that she knew. She'd been in difficult confrontations before. She would get through this one. But right now, in the quiet of her apartment, she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not quite grief, not quite anger. Something in the territory between them. She had built this company on the belief that how you treated people mattered, that loyalty was real and worth investing in, that the culture she was trying to create had actual substance and not just language, and someone had lived inside that culture, had been nourished by it, had used the trust and access and goodwill it produced to try and break her. She didn't know whether that invalidated the belief or just the person. She genuinely didn't know. And she understood, sitting there in the dark with the city humming quietly outside her window, that she was going to be carrying that question for a long time after the investigation was closed and the confrontation was done and everything had been resolved into whatever it resolved into. Some fractures didn't fully close. You learned to work around them. You learned to test things differently. She thought about what Rowan had said, work backward from the physical reality. The aircraft tells you what actually happened. She'd been reading the instruments. She needed to look at the aircraft. She wasn't sure yet what that meant, practically, for how she ran her company, but she knew it meant something, and she filed it away alongside everything else that was accumulating in the part of her that processed things slowly and produced answers when she wasn't looking. She went to bed at 10. She slept 4 hours, which was 2 more than the night before, and she counted that as progress. The personal email records came through on the third day. Marcus called her at 7:15 in the morning while she was still in the elevator up to her office, and the tone of his voice, flat, controlled, with that specific quality of someone managing their own reaction to something, told her before he said a word that what they'd found was worse than they'd expected. "My office," he said, "when you're upstairs." She was there in 4 minutes. He had the records printed, which was unusual for Marcus, who preferred screens and disliked paper trails. The fact that he'd printed them told her he wanted her to hold the physical pages, to have something real in her hands while she processed this. It was a small act of consideration that she noticed and didn't comment on. She sat down and read. The emails between Griffin Lowell and Dessa Kimball went back 14 weeks, not 6. 14 weeks of a conversation conducted through personal accounts, specifically to avoid the monitoring that company email was subject to, a fact they'd been explicit about in the very first message, which opened with Griffin writing, "Using this address so we can speak freely," and Dessa responding within 20 minutes with "good thinking." I've been waiting for someone with actual operational insight to come to me with this. Valeria read that exchange twice. The phrase actual operational insight landed with a particular kind of ugliness. It was Dessa positioning Griffin as the internal voice of reason, the person who could confirm from the inside what she'd been arguing from the outside, which meant Dessa had been looking for this. She hadn't just received Griffin's approach, she'd created conditions where someone like Griffin would come to her. The emails covered a lot of ground. There was a long thread about leadership structure, about what Dessa characterized as strategic drift at the CEO level, about the acquisition 18 months ago that Hargrove had questioned and that Dessa had apparently never stopped being skeptical about. There were discussions of specific board members, who was persuadable, who was reliable. There was a thread from 6 weeks ago in which Griffin had written, "She's planning a major partnership trip to Geneva in October. If that trip doesn't happen, the optics going into the November board meeting are very difficult for her. Hargrove is already primed." And Dessa had written back, "What can be done about the trip?" That was the line. That was the one that sat in Valeria's chest like a splinter. What can be done about the trip? Not a suggestion, not an instruction, a question. Dessa had asked the question and Griffin had answered it with 11 minutes on a rainy airfield. She put the pages down. "There's more," Marcus said. She looked at him. Griffin's calendar. The lunch meeting 3 weeks ago with DK. We got a credit card record from his corporate expense account. He charged a meal to it and then filed it under a vendor meeting. The restaurant was 4 blocks from Dessa Kimball's address. He expensed the lunch he used to plan sabotage against me to my company. He did. She held that for a moment, then let it go because holding it wasn't useful. "There's also a third name," Marcus said. He pulled up something on his tablet. "We found a pattern of communications between Griffin and someone in your IT infrastructure team. A contractor named Soren Bale, been with the company 11 months. Bale appears to have been the person who helped Griffin identify the gap in the access logging system and who issued the temporary badge used to access the airfield. So Griffin didn't do this alone. Griffin managed the execution, Dessa provided the strategic direction and presumably the board-level cover, and Bale handled the technical access piece. 3 people." He set down the tablet. "That's the core of it. There may be others at the margins, people who knew something was happening without knowing exactly what, but these 3 are the architecture." Valeria was quiet for a moment, looking at the printouts on the table. She thought about what it took to build something like this. 14 weeks of careful, deliberate construction. Multiple people, multiple roles, each one fitted carefully into a plan that was designed to be invisible until it was done. Someone had thought hard about this. Someone had spent 14 weeks thinking about her specifically, about what she valued, what she needed, where she was exposed, and had built a mechanism around all of it. She felt for a moment something almost like respect for the precision of it, and then she felt sick. "How's Rowan Hale's statement holding up?" she asked. It was a slightly left-field question, and Marcus registered that, but he answered it straight. His account is consistent and detailed and matches the physical evidence completely. If this goes to any kind of formal legal process, he's going to be a strong evidentiary anchor. A pause. He's also, for the record, not asked me anything about what happens next for him. Not once. I noticed that. Unusual, Marcus said. Very. She stood up, collected the printouts, and handed them back to him. I need 2 more days. I have 3 board members I need to talk to before we move. You think you can get them before Dessa makes a move? Dessa doesn't know what we have yet. She thinks the investigation is about aircraft maintenance. She has no reason to believe anyone has connected her emails to a sabotage device. Valeria picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She's going to sit very still and very confident for the next few days because she believes this is still running on her timeline. And when you've talked to the board members, then we move. All at once. She looked at Marcus. I want Griffin, Dessa, and Bale handled simultaneously. I don't want any of them to have a window to coordinate their response. Can you manage that? If you give me the timing, yes. 2 days. She paused at the door. And Marcus, the employment lawyers need to be fully briefed today. Not just flagged, briefed. I want them ready to move. She went back to her office and closed the door and sat at her desk and looked at her calendar for the day. She had a 9 o'clock operational review, a 10:30 call with the head of her legal team about a separate contract matter, lunch that she'd been planning to skip, a 2 o'clock session with her communications director, and a board member check-in at 4 that she now understood was not a routine check-in, but an early phase of what she was trying to counter. She rearranged everything and blocked 2 hours in the middle of the day. She made 3 calls to board members, Thomas Ashby, Claudia Park, and Renata Wells, and asked each of them for a private conversation, today if possible, framed as a matter of governance sensitivity. All 3 said yes within the hour. All 3 agreed to in-person meetings rather than calls, which was what she'd asked for. Thomas Ashby was first, at 11. He was 62, a former aerospace attorney, had been on her board from nearly the beginning and was the person she trusted most in that room. She drove to his office personally rather than having him come to her building because she needed the conversation to be completely off Cross Arrow's infrastructure, and she sat across from him in his conference room with the door closed and told him the truth. Not everything, not the names, not the specific evidence, but the shape of it. Her aircraft had been deliberately sabotaged by people inside her company in coordination with a board member, with the explicit goal of weakening her position before the November meeting. She had documentation. She was 2 days from a formal confrontation. Thomas was quiet for a long time after she finished. Which board member? He said. I can't tell you yet. 2 days. Is it Hargrove? I can't tell you yet, Thomas. He looked at her. He had a lawyer's eyes. Evaluating, measuring, not unkind, but not easy to deceive. You're telling me this now because you need me to understand what's coming before it arrives. Yes. And you need to know where I stand. I need to know where you stand. He leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. I've been on 6 boards in my career, Valeria. I've seen leadership challenges. I've seen politics. I've seen the occasional genuine misconduct. What you're describing, Kriki, coordinating with an internal employee to sabotage company property, that's not a governance dispute. That's a crime. I know. Are you going to the authorities? After the internal confrontation? I want to control the sequence. She looked at him steadily. I need to remove these people from the company and the board before they have a public platform to reframe what they did. You're afraid of the narrative. I'm afraid of the chaos, she said, which was more honest. I have a company with 360 employees and relationships with dozens of clients. If this becomes a public free-for-all before it's resolved, people get hurt who had nothing to do with it. Thomas nodded slowly. What do you need from me? 2 days of quiet, and then, when I move, I need to know that the governance process responds correctly, that the board acts on the evidence rather than on, she paused, on whatever story might be constructed about it. You'll have it. He said it simply, without drama, and she believed him. Claudia Park and Renata Wells were variations on the same conversation, tailored to what she knew about each of them. Claudia was more cautious, asked more questions, needed more reassurance that the legal framework was solid before she committed. Renata was faster. The moment she understood what Valeria was describing, her response was sharp and clear and immediate. "Tell me what you need and when," she said. "I'm in." By the time Valeria got back to her office at 3:30, she had 3 board members who understood what was coming and were aligned to respond correctly. Combined with Hargrove, who was involved but had apparently been kept at arm's length from the sabotage itself, he'd been receptive to the narrative, but there was no evidence yet that he'd known about the device. And 2 other members who were neutral and persuadable. She had the votes she needed if the confrontation triggered a board action. She also had a message from Dennis. Rowan Hale's contracting information as requested. Attached. Also, he called to ask if there was anything else Marcus's team needed from him. Wanted me to pass that along. She looked at the message for a moment. He'd called not to ask about his own situation, but to ask if there was anything else they needed. She pulled up his contracting file and read through it while sitting at her desk, and then she put it aside and went back to managing the afternoon. But she thought about him in the margins of everything else. She thought about what it took to be that person. The one who showed up, did the right thing, and then quietly asked if there was anything more that needed doing. She'd spent most of her career in rooms where people showed up and immediately established what credit they were owed. It was so normalized that she'd stopped noticing it as a choice. Rowan Hale was making a different choice, and he was making it apparently without being aware it was unusual. The 4 o'clock meeting with the board member, a man named Elliot Sears, one of the neutral members, was routine on the surface. A check-in about the November agenda, questions about the Geneva situation, the kind of gentle temperature-taking that board members did when they were trying to understand the political weather without being seen to be doing so. Valeria handled it smoothly, said the right amount, withheld the right amount, and walked him out feeling confident she understood exactly where he was positioned. When he was gone, she sat at her desk for 5 minutes in silence. One more day. She needed one more day of this, and then it was done. The next morning came in fast and gray, the city outside her window wrapped in the kind of low cloud that made October feel like a warning. She was at her desk by 7, had already spoken to Marcus, had already reviewed a new batch of records his team had surfaced overnight. Text messages from Griffin's personal phone, obtained through a process she hadn't asked the details of, that filled in several remaining gaps in the timeline. There was one exchange from 8 days ago, 3 days before the airfield, in which Griffin had written to a number she didn't recognize. Device ready, using the timer so it activates during pre-flight. Will look like a system failure. The response had been a single word, confirmed. The number traced to a burner phone purchased 6 weeks ago. They couldn't ID the person at the end of it yet, but given the timing and context, it was almost certainly Bale, the IT contractor, confirming the handoff of the device. Marcus had also found something else. The device itself, now in the custody of a forensic electronics firm, had been sourced from a specialty supplier that sold components primarily to defense and aerospace contractors. Purchasing records from that supplier, obtained through the firm's legal team, showed an order placed 10 weeks ago under a company name that didn't appear in any business registry. A shell. But the shipping address was a storage facility 5 miles from Griffin Lowell's home address. It was, as evidence packages went, as complete as it was going to get. She called Marcus at 7:45. "Tomorrow morning," she said, 8 o'clock. A pause. "I'll have everything in place. Griffin first. His office, not a conference room. I want him to be in his own space when he understands what we have. It'll be harder for him to perform." She'd thought about this, about the specific choreography of the confrontation, in the way she thought about difficult things, systematically, practically, without sentimentality. Bale simultaneously, security team at his desk at 8 sharp, and Dessa Kimball gets a call from our legal team at 8 o'clock precisely, informing her that the board is aware of her correspondence with a now former employee and that her position is under review. "That's going to be a significant call," Marcus said. "I know what it is." She paused. "Make sure legal has the email records on hand when they call her.
I want her to understand immediately that we have the specific content, not just the fact of the communication. Done. Another pause. Valeria, how are you doing with all of this? It was an unusual question for Marcus, who was professional to the point where personal questions felt almost grammatically incorrect from him. She recognized that he was asking because he was genuinely concerned and had decided the concern was more important than the professional convention. I'm okay, she said. I'll be better tomorrow at 8:15. He accepted that. She spent the rest of the morning and most of the afternoon working with almost deliberate normalcy, answering emails, reviewing contracts, taking a call with the Geneva contact who had graciously agreed to a video meeting in 2 weeks, managing the ordinary machinery of the company. She ran her 1:30 meeting with characteristic efficiency, watching Griffin across the table, holding the weight of what she knew while he updated the room on aircraft operations with complete professional composure. She was almost impressed. She didn't want to be, but she was. It took a specific kind of nerve to sit in this room and look this comfortable. At 3:15, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she almost didn't recognize immediately. Then she did. She'd added it to her contacts after the night at the airfield. Ms. Cross, Rowan Hale. Sorry to bother you. I was going to go through Dennis, but I thought it was better to reach out directly. I wanted to flag something I noticed in the maintenance records I was asked to review as part of my statement. I may have found a second anomaly unrelated to the device. Not sure if it's relevant to the investigation, but I didn't want to sit on it. Let me know if Marcus's team should hear about it. She read the message twice. He hadn't gone to Dennis. He'd weighed the options and decided a direct message was better, which showed both judgment and a certain specific kind of respect, the willingness to go around process when process was the slower path to the right outcome. And he'd flagged something he'd found in records he was reviewing for someone else's investigation, with no angle in it, no positioning, just I found something and I didn't want to sit on it. She wrote back, "Tell Marcus directly. Here's his number. And yes, relevant. He'll want to hear it." She sent Marcus's number and sat with her phone for a moment, and then she put it down and went back to work. At 5, Dennis knocked on her open door. "You have a visitor." "I don't have anything on the calendar." "She doesn't have an appointment. It's Dessa Kimball." The room shifted, not visibly. Valeria didn't move, didn't change her expression, but internally something tightened and then steadied. "Send her in," she said. Dennis stepped aside. Dessa Kimball came through the door with the specific energy of someone who has decided to get ahead of something. She was 53, elegantly put together in the way that cost serious money and effort to look effortless. With gray-streaked hair she wore short and sharp. She'd built her reputation as a turnaround specialist, someone you brought in when a company was underperforming and needed structural surgery. She'd been successful at it. She was also, in Valeria's current estimation, someone who had looked at Cross Arrow and seen not a company to serve, but a company to reposition around a different center of gravity. Valeria. She came in without being invited to sit, sat anyway. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're interrupting," Valeria said pleasantly. "What can I do for you, Dessa?" Something moved behind Dessa's eyes. A brief recalibration, because she'd expected a different entry point. "I wanted to check in personally about the aircraft situation. I understand the investigation is ongoing." "It is. And you're managing it well, I'm sure." The "I'm sure" was doing complicated work. It was both a compliment and a frame, positioning her as evaluating Valeria's management rather than expressing genuine confidence in it. The board is naturally interested in understanding what happened. Any operational incident involving company assets and executive travel is a security matter that's being handled through the appropriate channels, Valeria said. As you know, Dessa, those channels exist specifically to ensure that sensitive investigations aren't compromised by premature information sharing. She held Dessa's gaze. "I'm sure you understand the importance of that." A beat. She saw it, just for a fraction of a second, the smallest crack in the composed surface. Dessa processed the sentence, heard something in it, and couldn't quite determine whether she was hearing what she thought she was hearing. "Of course," Dessa said. "I didn't mean to suggest—" "How are you, generally?" Valeria asked. The shift in direction was deliberate. "It must be a busy time. The November meeting is coming up. I know you've been engaged on the agenda." "Very engaged, yes." Dessa recovered.
She was good at recovery. There are some structural questions I've been hoping to raise at the meeting. I think the board has a responsibility to examine the strategic direction of the company, Valeria said. I know, you've been clear about that in various contexts. She let that sentence breathe for exactly 1 second. I look forward to the conversation. Dessa looked at her, really looked, with the specific attention of someone trying to determine whether a person knows more than they're saying. Valeria returned her gaze with perfect, even warmth. The warmth of someone who has absolutely nothing to hide, which was, of course, the exact opposite of the situation, and she maintained it long enough for Dessa to decide she was imagining the subtext. Well, Dessa stood. I'll let you get back to your evening. Thanks for stopping by. She watched Dessa go, heard her heels on the floor in the corridor, heard the elevator, and then the sound dissolved into the building's ambient hum. She held her composure for 30 more seconds, just in case, and then she let out a slow breath through her nose and pressed the heels of her palms against the edge of her desk for a moment. Dessa had come because she was nervous, not because she knew anything, she didn't know what the investigation had found, but because her instincts were good enough to pick up on something atmospheric, some change in the quality of the situation she couldn't quite locate. She'd come to read Valeria's face, and she'd gotten nothing useful, which meant she'd leave slightly more uncertain than she'd arrived, which was fine. Tomorrow morning at 8, uncertain wouldn't help her. Valeria packed up her desk at 6, later than usual, and drove home through the October dark. She stopped at a diner 2 blocks from her apartment, not somewhere she usually went, a neighborhood place with booths and menus in plastic sleeves and coffee served in ceramic mugs, and ate a plate of eggs and toast sitting alone at a corner table, watching the street through the window. She thought about what came after. The confrontation, the removal, the legal process that would follow, the board conversation that needed to happen, the company she'd have to steady in the aftermath of everything coming out. There were weeks of hard work on the other side of tomorrow morning, and none of it would be clean or simple. But she thought, too, about something that had been sitting at the back of her mind for 4 days, since the night on the airfield, since the plastic chairs and the terrible coffee and the man in the grease-stained jacket who'd crouched next to her aircraft and read the truth off a fastener. She'd been running her company by looking at data, by managing outputs, tracking metrics, reviewing performance reports that told her what her systems were telling her, which was not, she now understood with complete clarity, the same as knowing what was actually happening inside them. She'd looked at Griffin Lowell's performance metrics for 7 years and they'd been excellent. She'd looked at the culture surveys, the retention numbers, the division performance reports, and they'd told her a story of a healthy organization that she had now conclusively established was not entirely the organization that existed. The instruments had been lying because someone had learned what the instruments measured and performed accordingly, and she'd never looked at the aircraft itself. She didn't know yet exactly what that meant in practical terms, what changes she needed to make, what she needed to start looking at differently. She knew it was going to require something from her that was harder than strategic thinking or operational control. It was going to require a different quality of attention, the kind of attention that required slowing down enough to notice a fastener that didn't belong. She finished her eggs, left a tip that was probably too large, and walked home through the cold air. Tomorrow at 8. Then everything that came after. She slept 6 hours. It was enough. The morning of the confrontation arrived without ceremony, the way important mornings usually did. Gray light, the smell of coffee, a city that didn't know anything significant was about to happen inside a building on its 14th floor. She was at her desk at 7:30. Marcus appeared at 7:45 with a quiet knock and came in and closed the door, and they went through the sequence one final time. Griffin at 8, his office, Marcus and 2 members of the security team plus the employment lawyer. Bale at 8, simultaneously, security team at his workstation in the IT infrastructure area. Legal calling Dessa at 8 sharp. "Ready?" Marcus said. "Yes," she said. They walked. Griffin Lowell's office was at the end of the aircraft operations corridor on the 12th floor, a reasonable-sized space that he'd furnished simply: desk, a couch for informal meetings, a credenza with framed photographs of aircraft he'd worked with over his career. He was already at his desk when they came through the door, coffee in hand, looking at his screen with the focused composure of a man starting his workday. Normally,
He looked up, saw Valeria, saw Marcus, saw the employment lawyer, saw the two security team members flanking the door. She watched his face move through a sequence: surprise, reassessment, the beginning of something she might have called fear if she'd wanted to be generous, and then settle into a controlled stillness that she recognized, because she'd worn that expression herself when she'd sat across from him in those weeks of meetings. The expression of someone deciding what face to put on the situation. "Griffin," she said. She sat down across from his desk without waiting. "We're going to need about an hour." She opened her folder and put the first page on the desk between them. He looked at it. She watched him recognize what he was looking at. His coffee cup made a small sound as he set it down too quickly on the desk. "I want you to understand," she said, her voice completely level, "that I'm going to show you everything we have. Not because you deserve the consideration, but because I want you to sit with all of it, every piece. I want you to understand exactly how completely this is finished." She turned to the next page. "And then we're going to talk about what comes next for you, and the range of outcomes available to you, and the single variable that determines which of those outcomes you get." He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. "Not yet," she said. "Look at the pages first." She let him read. She sat across from him and waited, watching his face process each document: the maintenance records with his access code, the camera footage, the email records, the device sourcing information, the text message about the timer. She'd arranged them in chronological order, which meant he read his own plot from the beginning, watched himself build the thing step by step in a sequence of documents that made the architecture of it unmistakable. When he reached the last page, the text message, "Device ready, confirmed," he put it down and looked at the desk and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then, "How much of this can you prove in a courtroom?" The employment lawyer answered that one, because it wasn't Valeria's question to answer. The lawyer went through each document, each chain of evidence, each authentication status, with the methodical clarity of someone who had briefed this exact case for 2 days and knew it precisely. Griffin listened. His face went through a few more iterations. Calculation, something that might have been anger, something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. When the lawyer finished, Griffin looked at Valeria. "What's the variable?" he said. "Whether you cooperate fully with the civil and criminal process," she said. "Everything you know about who was involved, what was planned, every communication you had, not an edited version, everything." She held his gaze. "If you give me that, our legal team has flexibility on the specific nature of the charges we pursue. If you don't," she picked up the folder and closed it, "then you're alone in this, and what we have is already enough." He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the car she'd sent when his daughter was born, and the Christmas parties, and the briefing meeting where he'd asked smart questions and taken notes. She thought about how long he'd been building this alongside all of it, how long the two versions of Griffin Lowell had coexisted in the same offices, at the same tables. She didn't feel sorry for him. She wanted to check, to make sure she wasn't suppressing it, some part of her that still registered the 7 years. But she checked and found nothing soft there. Only clarity. "I'll cooperate," he said. His voice was different now, quieter, with the deflated quality of something that had been holding pressure for a long time and was finally letting it out. "I'll tell you everything." "I know you will," she said. She stood. "Marcus will stay with you. The lawyer will stay with you. I'm going to go run my company." She walked out of his office and down the corridor, past the photographs of aircraft on the walls, past the framed maintenance certifications, past the ordinary machinery of a division that had been running exactly as it was supposed to run on the outside while something entirely different ran underneath. Her phone showed 2 messages. Marcus's team. Bail secured, cooperating. Legal. Kimball has been notified. She's requesting to speak with board counsel. Proceeding as planned. She read them standing in the corridor and then put her phone in her pocket and stood there for a moment in the gray morning light coming through the window at the end of the hall. It was done. Not finished. There were weeks of process ahead, board conversations and legal filings, and the slow work of rebuilding. But the thing that had been moving in the dark beneath her company for 14 weeks had been brought into the light, and light was the end of it. She stood there for a moment and let herself feel the weight of it.
Not satisfaction, not relief exactly. Something more complicated than either. The kind of feeling that came with stopping something you hadn't known was happening until it almost had. Then she went back to work. The week after the confrontation was the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not acute, just relentless. The kind of hard that didn't announce itself with a single moment you could brace for, but instead arrived as 100 smaller moments stacked end to end, each one requiring something from her, and the cumulative weight of them building into something she felt in her body by Thursday as a dull pressure behind her sternum that no amount of coffee or controlled breathing fully addressed. Griffin's cooperation turned out to be thorough, which was almost worse than if he'd stonewalled. A person who stonewalls gives you something to push against. Griffin sat in a room with Marcus and the employment lawyer for 6 hours on the day of the confrontation and told them everything with the deflated precision of someone who had decided, once the decision was made, to make it completely. He laid out the full timeline. The first conversation with Dessa 14 weeks ago, the gradual escalation from board-level maneuvering to the idea of something more concrete, the moment 6 weeks ago when the Geneva trip had appeared on the internal schedule and Dessa had asked her question and Griffin had sat with it for 3 days before deciding the answer was yes. He said he thought it would just look like a mechanical failure, Marcus told her that evening, that the investigation would go nowhere and the optics would do the work without any real risk. He didn't count on anyone looking closely enough. He said that too. Marcus paused. He said the ground crew wasn't supposed to be near the aircraft that night. There was a staffing adjustment he'd flagged through operations that should have kept the third shift team occupied elsewhere. It didn't work the way he'd planned. Valeria sat with that for a moment. A staffing adjustment. Griffin had tried to clear the field, had arranged for the ground crew to be somewhere other than near the jet, and it hadn't worked because Rowan Hale had been finishing a service check on a fuel truck on the opposite side of the airfield and had drifted over when the commotion started, the way any curious, observant person would. The entire thing had hinged on that, on a man finishing a fuel truck service check at the wrong time, from Griffin's perspective, on that same man being the specific kind of person who looked at aircraft instead of instruments. She told Marcus to make sure that fact was in the formal record. He said it already was. The board conversation happened on a Thursday, 2 days after the confrontation. She'd asked Thomas Ashby to convene an emergency session, which he did, and she walked into the boardroom at 9 in the morning and presented the complete evidence package to 8 people sitting around a table, some of whom she trusted and at least one of whom she was watching carefully. Hargrove sat at the far end of the table and didn't say much for the first 40 minutes, which told her everything she needed to know about his level of surprise. He hadn't known about the device, she was now fairly certain of that, but he'd known about the board-level maneuvering and had been a willing participant in it. When the full picture was on the table in front of the room, his silence had the quality of a man recalibrating his position in real time. When she finished presenting, she answered questions for 90 minutes. Good questions from Thomas, Claudia, and Renata. Careful questions from the neutral members. And from Hargrove, eventually, a question about process, about what governance protections had failed and what would prevent something like this from happening again. That was technically reasonable and personally infuriating because it was the question of someone trying to reposition themselves as concerned rather than complicit. She answered it directly and without editorializing because she needed the board to move and she needed Hargrove to have a path to correct behavior. And she was practical enough to understand that a cornered person becomes unpredictable and an uncornered person can sometimes be redirected. By the end of the session, the board had voted to accept Dessa Kimball's forced resignation. The legal team had given Dessa the specific choice between resignation and a public board removal, and she'd resigned, which was what Valeria had expected, and had authorized the company to pursue civil and criminal referrals against Griffin and Bale. Hargrove voted with the majority on both counts, which cost him nothing and bought him a degree of distance from the mess, and she let him have that because fighting it would have been a distraction she couldn't afford. When it was over and people were filing out, Thomas stopped beside her. "How are you really doing?" he said. "I'm functional," she said, which was honest. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture so out of character for him that it landed with more weight than a longer speech would have. "You handled this exactly right, all of it." She thanked him and walked out. The media piece was its own complicated operation. She couldn't control the story entirely. There were too many moving parts, too many people who knew fragments of it. But she could control the sequence of disclosure, and she had her communications director working alongside legal to ensure that the public statement came out on her terms and on her timeline. The statement was factual and measured and said what it needed to say without saying more. A serious breach of company policy and trust had been identified. The individuals responsible had been removed, and the matter had been referred to law enforcement. No names until the legal process required them. No dramatic language. Nothing that invited a narrative she hadn't approved. It ran on Friday morning and generated the kind of coverage she'd expected. Business press mostly, some speculation about the specific nature of the breach, a couple of analysts who took the opportunity to note the coincidence with the canceled Geneva trip. She did one interview, a 15-minute call with a financial journalist she had a long-standing relationship with, and in that interview she said the company was stable, the situation was resolved, and the Geneva partnership discussions were proceeding on a rescheduled timeline. The analyst community, which had been buzzing since the grounding, quieted somewhat. Not completely. Questions would linger until the legal process played out publicly, but the acute noise settled. By Friday afternoon, she was sitting at her desk, surrounded by the paperwork of aftermath, HR documentation for Griffin's termination, restructuring plans for the aircraft operations division that now needed new leadership, security protocol reviews that Marcus had initiated across all 3 airfields, legal correspondence about the criminal referral. And she was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. Dennis appeared in her doorway with a look on his face that she'd learned over 3 years meant he was about to say something she might not want to hear. "What?" she said. The second anomaly that Rowan Hale flagged. Marcus's team finished the analysis. She'd half forgotten about that message. The one Rowan had sent on Tuesday afternoon, saying he'd found something in the maintenance records. She'd passed it to Marcus, and then the confrontation had consumed everything. And? It wasn't related to the sabotage. It was an actual maintenance issue, a discrepancy in the inspection cycle documentation for the number 2 engine. Marcus says it's a paperwork problem, not a mechanical one, but it would have created a compliance gap that could have been flagged in a regulatory audit. Dennis paused. He found it while reviewing documents for someone else's investigation, and he flagged it even though it had nothing to do with his own situation. She looked at Dennis for a moment. "Thank you. I just thought you'd want to know," he said, and retreated. She sat with that for a few minutes. The compliance gap was minor, a documentation discrepancy, not a safety issue, but it was real, and Rowan had found it while doing something else entirely, and he'd flagged it because he'd found it, with no calculation about whether doing so was strategically useful to him. She thought about what his contracting file had told her. He was on a standard contract through Meridian Aviation Services. The rate was reasonable, but not exceptional. The current assignment ran through the end of the calendar year. After that, the contract would either be renewed, extended, or not, based on operational need as assessed by the division manager, who was now a position that needed to be filled. She opened a new document on her laptop and started writing. Not an offer yet. Not formally. Just the shape of something she was beginning to think about clearly enough to put into words. She wrote for 20 minutes, then closed the document and went back to the afternoon's paperwork. She had a lot to rebuild. She understood that. The investigation had resolved the immediate crisis, but what it had revealed about the gaps in her systems, about the quality of attention she'd been bringing to her own company, about the difference between what the instruments reported and what the aircraft was actually doing, that didn't resolve itself just because the source of it had been removed. Those were structural questions. They were going to require structural answers. She went home at 7:30, earlier than she'd managed all week. Her apartment was quiet, in the particular way of spaces that are usually empty, and she stood in her kitchen for a moment without turning on the lights, just standing in the dark with the city glow coming through the windows, feeling the week settle around her like sediment. 7 years. She kept coming back to that. Not with sentimentality. She was past sentimentality about Griffin, but with the particular curiosity of trying to understand how she'd missed it. Not the practical answer, which was that he'd been careful and strategic and had used the tools her own culture provided to conceal what he was doing. That part she understood. What she was still trying to understand was the deeper question. Whether she'd missed it because it was genuinely hidden, or whether some part of her had chosen not to see it because seeing it would have required a kind of attention she'd been too busy to sustain. She didn't have a clean answer. She ordered food she didn't particularly want, ate half of it, and went to bed at 9:30 like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a week and had finally put it down. She woke up Saturday morning to a clear sky, the first in 10 days, and October sunlight coming through her curtains at an angle that made the apartment look different than it usually did. She made coffee and stood at the window and watched the street below, where a man was walking a dog that kept sitting down and refusing to move, and the man kept stopping and waiting with the specific patience of someone who'd given up fighting about it. She thought about what she was going to do with the day. She had no meetings, she had correspondence she could answer, documents she could review, the ongoing work of running a company that didn't stop on weekends just because she wanted it to. All of that was there. But she also had something that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Tuesday, since the message on her phone, since the moment she'd understood that Rowan Hale had found a real maintenance issue while reviewing documents for someone else's investigation and had flagged it without being asked because he'd found it, and not flagging it would have meant sitting on it, and he didn't do that. She finished her coffee, went and got dressed, picked up her phone, and found the number she'd saved. He answered on the third ring. "Ms. Cross?" A beat. "This is unexpected. I'm sorry to call on a Saturday. It's fine. We're between dinosaur pancakes and the park, so the timing's okay." She heard background noise, a child's voice, something that might have been a cartoon. "Everything all right with the investigation?" "The investigation is resolved," she said. "That's actually part of why I'm calling. I wanted to speak with you in person if you have time today. Nothing formal, not an official meeting. I can come to you." A pause. She heard him process that, the CEO of the company that contracted his employer offering to come to him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to. I'd like to." She looked at the street below, the man and the dog, both of them standing still now and apparently having reached some kind of agreement. "If it's convenient. If not, we can find another time." Another pause. "We're doing the park around 11. After that, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock?" 1 o'clock works. Send me the address." She put down her phone and stood for a moment, and then she went to find her coat because October had turned genuinely cold. His address was in a neighborhood 20 minutes from downtown, not far in distance, but a different kind of place. Streets lined with older houses and small front yards. The kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors, and the local diner had the same breakfast specials for 20 years. She parked on the street and walked up the front path of a house that was small and slightly worn around the edges, with a porch that had 2 chairs on it and a collection of potted plants that were going to need to come inside soon before the first freeze got them. Before she reached the door, it opened, and a girl appeared in it. 6 years old, with her father's gray eyes, and a gap where a front tooth was missing, and a very serious expression that resolved into something more comfortable when she decided Valeria was acceptable. "Are you the lady from Dad's work?" the girl said. "I am. I'm Valeria." "I'm Maya." She considered this for a moment. "We have cookies. Dad made them this morning. He makes them when he's nervous." She said this with the candor of someone who hadn't yet learned to protect other people's information. Rowan appeared behind her, looking like someone who absolutely heard that. "Maya." "She asked who I was," Maya said, entirely without apology. He looked at Valeria with an expression she couldn't entirely classify, somewhere between mild mortification and the helpless fondness of a parent who has long since accepted that their child is going to say the true thing at the wrong moment forever. "Come in," he said. "Sorry about the editorial." "I liked the editorial," Valeria said. The house was small and lived in, and not particularly tidy in the way of houses where a child genuinely lived in them rather than being kept in a separate, managed zone. There were drawings on the refrigerator held up by mismatched magnets, a small pair of sneakers in the middle of the hallway, a bookshelf in the living room that held children's books on the lower shelves, and technical manuals on the upper ones. There was a couch that had seen substantial use, and a coffee table with a ring stain from a mug that had clearly been there long enough to become part of the furniture. It felt like a place where someone actually lived. That sounds like a simple thing, but Valeria's apartment was furnished and ordered in a way that sometimes made visitors remark that it looked like a hotel suite, which she'd always taken as a neutral observation and was only now reconsidering. He brought coffee without asking if she wanted it, which she appreciated. Maya settled on the couch with a book that she made a show of reading while clearly listening to everything, which was fine. Valeria had been the same kind of child. "The investigation," she said. "It's resolved. 3 people removed from the company, criminal referrals filed. The board has been briefed and appropriate governance actions have been taken." He nodded. He'd probably tracked some of it in the news, but he didn't say so. "And the company?" "Stable, still standing." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. "Your statement was important to the case. The physical evidence you identified was the foundation that everything else was built on. Without it, we might have had a very different 6 days. Without it," he said, "you might have had a very different flight." She held his gaze. "Yes. Without it, the pilots might have been dealing with the anomalies over the Atlantic. The device was designed to cause a grounding, not a crash, but design devices don't always perform as designed." He absorbed that quietly. She watched something move through his face. Not relief, more like the particular weight of understanding that a thing you did mattered in a way you hadn't fully reckoned with until it was said plainly. "I found a maintenance discrepancy," he said. "In the records I reviewed for the statement. I passed it to Marcus Chen." "I know. He addressed it. Thank you for that, too." "It wasn't related to anything, Miss. It was just a paperwork issue. But it was there. And you flagged it." "It would have been weird not to," he said. Like the alternative wasn't really an alternative. Like leaving it unreported would have required an active decision to do something against his nature. Valeria set down her coffee. She'd been building to this, and she wasn't the kind of person who delayed when she'd decided something, so she said it. "I want to offer you a role," she said. "Not through Meridian, directly, with Cross Arrow. The head of my aircraft operations division is no longer with the company." She watched him register that. "The role is broader than what you're doing now. It involves oversight of maintenance protocols across all 3 of my airfields, quality assurance, compliance, and a direct reporting line to me on anything safety related." She paused. "It's a significant step from your current position. I want to be honest about that. The scope would be larger than anything you've managed before, and it would require things from you that your current role doesn't. I'm not offering it because I think it's an easy fit. I'm offering it because I think the quality of attention you bring to aircraft is exactly what I need in that position." He was quiet for long enough that she heard Maya turn a page in her book. "Why not promote from inside the division?" he said. It was, she thought, a very Rowan Hale question. Not what does it pay, or what does it come with, or even why me, but why not someone else, with the implicit suggestion that someone else might deserve it more. Because the people inside the division have been working under a set of assumptions and practices that I now need to fundamentally re-examine, she said. I need someone who looks at aircraft instead of instruments, who doesn't already know where the instruments point. She paused. And because in 8 days, every time something needed to be seen clearly, you saw it. That's not a small data set. He looked at his coffee. She let him think. Can I ask you something first? He said. Yes. You came here, on a Saturday, to my house. He looked up. Most people in your position would have had Dennis send an offer letter. Most people in my position, she said, have been running their company by reading reports. I'm trying something different. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly. More like a small internal recognition, the kind that registers when something lands correctly. I have a daughter, he said. It wasn't a refusal. It was a parameter. I know. Any role that requires me to be unavailable in the ways that... He paused, choosing the word. In the ways that kind of role usually requires. Travel, hours, the whole structure of it. That's a real constraint. I know that too. She'd thought about this. The role doesn't require what Griffin Lowell's role required. What I'm building is different from what I had. Smaller authority footprint, deeper accountability. The hours are real, but they're manageable, and the travel is occasional, not constant. She met his eyes. I'm not going to pretend it's simple. It won't always be. But I also won't build a job around a person and then hand them a life they can't sustain. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked across the room at Maya, who was pretending very hard to read her book. "How long do I have to decide?" he said. "Take a week," she said. "No pressure before that." "Okay." He picked up his coffee. Something in his posture had shifted. Not resolved, still holding the weight of the decision, but open to it in a way it hadn't been 60 seconds ago. "Do you want a cookie?" He asked it practically, like the conversation about her offering him a major career change and his terms for considering it had reached a natural resting point, and now they could have a cookie. She almost laughed, and the almost laugh felt like the same releasing thing as it had the first time, in her office on that Tuesday morning. "Yes," she said, "I actually do." He got up and went to the kitchen. Maya put down her book and looked at Valeria with the direct, undefended assessment of a 6-year-old who had decided to take the measure of someone. "Do you fly on airplanes?" Maya said. "I do, quite a lot. My dad fixes them so they don't break." She said it with the simple pride of someone stating a fact that she found self-evidently impressive. "I know," Valeria said. "He's very good at it." Maya considered this with appropriate gravity. "He says most people don't look carefully enough." Valeria looked at the girl, at the gray eyes that were her father's, and the gap-toothed seriousness, and the complete absence of any filter between her thoughts and her mouth. "He's right about that," she said. "I'm trying to get better at it." Maya nodded, satisfied, and picked her book back up. Rowan came back from the kitchen with a plate of cookies that were slightly overdone on the bottom, but otherwise looked perfectly reasonable. He sat down, and they sat in his lived-in living room on a clear October Saturday and ate cookies and talked. Not about the job, not about the investigation, just talked. And it was the most human Valeria had felt in at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. She stayed an hour. When she stood to go, Rowan walked her to the door, and Maya materialized at his side with the book still in her hand. "Come back," Maya said. As a statement, not an invitation, as someone who had made a decision about the matter. "Maya, Maya," Rowan said, in the tone of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by her and was only moderately managing it. "I will," Valeria said. And she meant it. She drove back through the Saturday streets in the October light, and she thought about the house with the worn couch and the drawings on the refrigerator and the potted plants that needed to come inside before the freeze. She thought about a man who made cookies when he was nervous and had a daughter who told strangers about it without a second thought. She thought about what it looked like to build a life around the actual substance of it rather than around the appearance of having one. She'd spent 10 years building something enormous and had lost sight, somewhere in the building of it, of the question that was supposed to be underneath all the building. Not just what are we building, but what is it for? She'd answered that question when she was 22 and starting out, and it had felt clear then, felt urgent and real, with the specific clarity that came from having nothing to lose and everything to prove. She still believed in the company, still believed in what it was trying to do, the infrastructure it provided, the people who worked there and depended on it. But she'd let the size of it become its own justification, and the metrics become their own purpose. And somewhere in that process, she'd stopped asking the underneath question with any regularity. A man with a daughter and a worn couch had a clear answer to that question. She could see it in every corner of his house. It wasn't aspirational or articulated, it was just visible, in the choices he made and the things he prioritized, and the way his face changed when he looked across the room at his kid. She wasn't going to have what he had. That wasn't the point. The point was the question, and that the question deserved a real answer, and that she'd been avoiding asking it for long enough that she'd stopped noticing she'd stopped asking. The city passed around her, its Saturday face on, unhurried and ordinary, and she drove through it with the window cracked because the cold air helped her think. She had a board meeting in 3 weeks. She had a division to restructure, a leadership gap to fill, a Geneva partnership to close, a legal process to oversee. She had a communication strategy to manage, and a security protocol review to complete, and 100 other things that were sitting in her inbox and on her calendar and in the minds of the 360 people whose livelihoods were connected to her judgment. She had all of that, and she was going to handle all of it. She always did. But she was going to start asking the underneath question again. Regularly, deliberately, with the specific quality of attention that it deserved. She was going to look at the aircraft and not just at the instruments. She parked in front of her building and sat in the car for a moment before going in. Thought about Monday, when she was going to walk back into the building and face the week and everything that week contained. Thought about the confrontation that was already behind her and the work that was still ahead, and the shape of something she was trying to articulate that wasn't fully articulated yet but was getting closer. Thought about a 6-year-old telling her to come back, in the tone of someone who had decided the matter. She got out of the car and went inside and started writing an email to Marcus about the security protocol review, because there was always something to do and she was always the person doing it. But the question sat with her while she wrote, quiet and persistent, the way real questions did. Not demanding an immediate answer, just making sure she knew it was there. She knew it was there. Rowan called on Thursday. She was in a meeting when her phone buzzed, a mid-morning session with her restructuring team about the aircraft operations division, ironic given who was calling. And she glanced at the screen, saw his name, and let it go to voicemail, which she almost never did because she almost never let calls go to voicemail. She had a discipline about it that bordered on compulsion, but this one she let sit because she didn't want to take it in a room full of people, and she didn't want to hear whatever his answer was surrounded by the bureaucratic machinery of the thing she'd offered him. She listened to the voicemail 20 minutes later, standing in the hallway outside the conference room with her back to the wall and her phone pressed to her ear. "Miss Cross, it's Rowan. I've been thinking about the offer and I want to talk through a few things before I give you a formal answer. Not concerns exactly. I've mostly worked through the concerns. More like questions about how you see the role developing. If you have time this week, I'd appreciate the conversation." A brief pause, and then quieter. "Also, Maya wanted me to tell you she finished her book. I don't know why that's relevant, but she was very insistent I mention it." Valeria stood in the hallway and did something she hadn't done in a long time. Smiled at her phone like an idiot, alone in a corridor, for reasons she wouldn't have been able to fully explain to anyone who asked. She called him back that afternoon, and they talked for 40 minutes. Not about terms or titles or reporting structures. Those things were in the written offer she'd had Dennis formalize and send to him on Monday. They talked about what she actually wanted the role to be, what she meant when she said she was building something different from what she'd had, what different looked like in practice, and the daily work of overseeing safety and maintenance across 3 airfields and a fleet of aircraft and a division of people who had been operating under assumptions she now needed to change. He asked good questions, specific, practical, without any performance of enthusiasm or any attempt to tell her what she wanted to hear. He pushed back twice, once on the scope of the compliance piece, which he thought was broader than he had the background for and said so plainly, and once on the reporting cadence she'd proposed, which he felt was too frequent to be useful and would create a bottleneck rather than a flow of information. She listened to both objections. The first one she acknowledged and proposed a solution, a structured handoff period with the compliance team that would build the background he didn't currently have. The second one she agreed with outright, because he was right and she'd proposed the cadence out of habit rather than logic, the reflex of a person who'd spent 10 years managing by staying close to every detail. "You don't actually want someone in that role who reports to you constantly," he said. Not argumentatively, just as an observation, the way he observed things. That would defeat the purpose. "You're right," she said. "I'm working on that reflex." "What reflex?" "The one where I manage by proximity instead of by trust." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard one to break." "I know." "For what it's worth," he said, "it's the right thing to break." She thought about that after the call ended. The right thing to break. It was such a simple construction, and he'd said it without any weight behind it, just as a fact he'd identified and was passing along. But it stayed with her the way simple, true things sometimes did, settling somewhere below the level of conscious thought and doing its work quietly. He called back Friday morning. She answered on the second ring. "Yes," he said. That was it, just yes. She felt something shift in her chest, and not relief exactly, more like the sensation of something clicking into correct position. "Good," she said. "We'll work out the start date with Meridian and get the contract paperwork moving. Dennis will be in touch." "Okay." A pause. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Were you worried I was going to say no?" She considered lying, which took about half a second. A little. Yes. Why? You could have found someone with more management experience. I told you why, she said. The quality of attention. She paused. And the cookies, which Maya said you made because you were nervous, which means you cared about the outcome, which is not nothing. He made a sound that was probably him trying not to laugh. I'm going to have a very serious conversation with that child about operational security. Good luck with that. After the call, she sat at her desk for a moment and thought about what she'd just done. She'd offered a significant leadership role to a man with no management experience, limited organizational authority background, and a skill set that was built almost entirely on the quality of his direct observation rather than on any conventional leadership credential. She'd done it because of what she'd seen in 8 days and because of what she'd recognized in a house with a worn couch and overdone cookies and a 6-year-old with her father's eyes. That was not how she normally made hiring decisions. She was a data person, a metrics person, a person who built decision frameworks and applied them consistently. She'd hired Griffin Lowell 7 years ago on the strength of an extraordinary track record and impeccable references and a series of interviews in which he demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking she'd been looking for. She was not going to spend a lot of time on the irony of that comparison, but she noticed it, and she filed it, and she added it to the growing collection of things she was trying to think about differently. The Geneva meeting happened on a Tuesday, 3.5 weeks after the night on the airfield, via video call rather than the in-person meeting she'd planned. She'd been honest with the partner about why. Not the sabotage specifically, not yet, but a security incident involving her aircraft that required a change of format. The partner had been gracious about it, and the call ran 2 hours and covered everything the in-person meeting would have covered, and by the end of it, the partnership framework was intact and moving toward formal documentation. It wasn't the same as being in the room. She knew that. There was something that happened in person that didn't happen through a screen, a quality of reading and being read, of the physical presence of trust being built or not built in real time, and she'd lost that for this particular meeting at this particular moment, because someone had decided her failure was useful to them. But the meeting had happened. The partnership was moving. And she'd learned in the weeks between the airfield and this call that she was more adaptable than she'd given herself credit for. That when the thing she'd planned for was taken from her, she could find another version of it that still worked, even if it required a different kind of work. The November board meeting arrived on a gray Tuesday morning that felt, climatically, like a continuation of the October storm. She drove to the building in the early dark, which she rarely did. She usually walked when the weather allowed, had always believed in the 30 minutes of city air and movement before the sealed environment of the office. But it was genuinely cold now, and she was carrying 2 bags and she'd been up since 5 reviewing her presentation, so she drove. The boardroom was on the 15th floor, one above Marcus's office, and it had a wall of windows that looked out over the city to the east, so that on clear mornings you got the sunrise and on gray mornings you got a wall of low cloud that sat on the skyline like something unfinished. Today it was cloud. She set up her materials at the head of the table and waited for people to arrive and thought about the last time she'd stood in this room, 2 weeks ago, presenting the evidence package that had changed the geometry of everything. The members filed in over the following 10 minutes. Thomas Ashby arrived first, gave her a brief nod. Claudia Park, Renata Wells. Elliot Sears, who had processed the events of the past weeks with more grace than she'd expected. Hargrove came in near the end and sat in his usual seat at the far end without making eye contact, which was fine. She didn't need his eye contact. The seat that Dessa Kimball had occupied for 2 years was empty, and no one mentioned it, which was the correct response to a person who had turned a governance role into a mechanism for harm. She opened the meeting herself, which was also a change. Board meetings usually opened with Thomas, in his role as the independent chair. She'd asked his permission to change the format this once, and he'd given it without needing to know why, because he trusted her judgment in the way that trust actually looked when it was real. I want to start differently today, she said. Not with the agenda. With something I've been thinking about for 3 weeks. The room was quiet. 8 people looking at her, each with their own reading of the past few weeks, their own investment in what came next. She talked for 20 minutes without notes. Not a presentation. She'd done the presentation, it was in the materials in front of them, but an account. Of what had happened, yes, but more than that, of what she'd understood from it, of the specific quality of blindness that had allowed it to happen, not Griffin's blindness, not Dessa's calculation, but her own. The way she'd managed her company by reading instruments and not looking at the aircraft. The gap between what her metrics told her and what was actually true inside the organization she'd built. She talked about what she was going to change, not in the abstract language of strategy, but specifically, the way she was going to restructure oversight of the operations division, the new protocols Marcus was implementing across the airfields, the way she was going to change her own relationship to the people who worked for her, the distinction between management by proximity and management by trust, and what she was trying to build instead. She talked about Rowan Hale, because she thought the room needed to understand that what had stopped the sabotage wasn't a system or a protocol, but a person. A specific kind of person doing a specific kind of looking. And that she'd spent 3 weeks thinking about what it meant to build a company that didn't accidentally marginalize those people in favor of the ones who knew how to perform well for instruments. When she finished, the room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when something real has just been said rather than something performed. Thomas was the first to speak. "The new aviation safety role you've created," he said. "Hale starts when?" 2 weeks. He nodded. "I'd like to see a briefing on the new protocol structure when it's finalized." "You'll have it." Hargrove cleared his throat at the far end of the table. Everyone waited. He had the careful expression of a person navigating between what they wanted to say and what was strategically advisable. "The Geneva Partnership timeline," he said. "Are we confident in the rescheduled framework?" It was a reasonable question, stripped of any content that could be used against him. She answered it fully and professionally and watched him accept the answer with a neutrality that told her he'd made his calculations and decided that supporting her going forward was more useful than continuing to work against her. She could live with that. She didn't need his conversion. She needed his vote, and she had it. The meeting ran 3 hours. By the end of it, the governance restructuring was approved, the new oversight protocols were endorsed, the Kimball seat was formally vacated with a process established for selecting a replacement, and Cross Arrow Solutions entered its 4th quarter with its leadership structure intact and its strategic direction affirmed. After the room cleared, Thomas stayed behind. He helped her gather her materials in a way that was slightly unnecessary, but she didn't say so. "I've been in this business a long time," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was straightening a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. "I've watched people face situations like this, and I've watched what it does to them." He paused. "Some people come through it and they're smaller, harder, but smaller. Like the thing that happened stripped something essential, and the person who came out the other side is just the part that survived." She waited. "You came through it bigger," he said. Simply, like an observation rather than a compliment. "I don't know if you know that yet, but I wanted to say it." She didn't have a clean response for that, so she just said, "Thank you, Thomas," and let it be what it was. She went back to her office and sat at her desk and let the afternoon quiet settle around her. The boardroom adrenaline was wearing off. It always did, leaving behind a specific flatness that she'd learned to expect and not mistake for emptiness. It wasn't emptiness. It was just the body returning to baseline after it had been running high. She thought about what came next, not strategically. She'd done that. It was in place. Just practically, in the immediate sense of the next few weeks. Rowan's start date, the compliance handoff, the restructuring of the operations division under new leadership. The legal process, which would move slowly through whatever machinery the courts involved it in, and which she'd mostly handed to outside counsel because she needed her attention elsewhere. The Geneva documentation, which her legal team was reviewing. The regular work of running a company that didn't pause for dramatic episodes and started piling up the moment you looked away from it. She had all of it. She'd always had all of it. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she now recognized immediately. "Maya wanted to know if you like macaroni and cheese. I told her that was probably not a relevant question. She disagrees and would like me to find out." Valeria looked at her phone for a long moment. Outside her window, the November city was doing what November cities did. Gray and purposeful, people moving with their heads down against the cold. the day closing in earlier than it had a month ago. She'd been sitting in this office looking at this view for long enough that she sometimes stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing the things that are always there. She typed back, "Tell her yes." Why? The response took about 2 minutes. "She's making dinner. We're having macaroni and cheese. She wanted to know if you wanted to come." I told her that was probably not a second message, mid-sentence. She just grabbed my phone. "This is Maya. Do you want to come for dinner? We have enough." Dad made extra. He says he didn't, but he did. Valeria read that twice. Felt something move through her that she couldn't have named if she'd tried. Something warm and slightly embarrassing and completely real. She typed, "What time?" The answer came back in seconds. 6. Maya says, "Don't bring anything. Dad says you can bring bread if you want because we're out." Maya is currently arguing with me about whether that was appropriate to say. She put down her phone and looked at her calendar. She had a 6 o'clock call with outside counsel about the criminal referral that she'd scheduled 2 weeks ago and had not rescheduled because she'd had no reason to. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the attorney directly and rescheduled the call for Thursday. And when the attorney asked if everything was all right, she said, "Yes, something's come up. Thursday works better." Something had come up. A 6-year-old in a house 20 minutes away who had grabbed her father's phone and sent a dinner invitation with the operational confidence of someone who had decided the matter and simply needed to communicate the logistics. She stopped at a bakery 2 blocks from her office and bought bread. A sourdough that the woman behind the counter recommended with the authority of someone who had strong opinions about bread and wanted them on record, and drove to a house with a porch and potted plants and a worn couch, arriving at 6:03 because she'd underestimated the traffic. Maya answered the door before she could knock. "You're late," Maya said, "by 3 minutes." "Dad says 3 minutes is still late." "Your dad is correct." She held up the bread. "I brought this." Maya examined it with the serious scrutiny of a 6-year-old food critic. "Okay," she said, which appeared to be approval, and stepped back to let her in. The house smelled like butter and something warm, and Rowan was in the kitchen doing something at the stove that involved the kind of focused attention he appeared to bring to everything. He turned when she came in. He was wearing an old sweatshirt and had flour or something similar on the forearm that he hadn't noticed, which was the kind of detail that made a person look more like themselves rather than less. "She grabbed my phone, like," he said, by way of explanation or apology or both. "I know, I was there for the messages." She set the bread on the counter. "The sourdough woman at the bakery wanted me to tell you she thinks it pairs well with butter, not olive oil." Strong stance. She had opinions. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to be able to read. A sort of quiet assessment, a checking of something, like he was making sure the thing in front of him matched what he'd registered before. She had the odd feeling that he was doing the same thing he did with aircraft, looking at the actual thing rather than the reported version. She didn't mind it. They ate at a kitchen table with mismatched chairs and Maya's drawings spread to one side because Maya had been working on something before dinner and had not been required to put it away immediately, which was apparently a negotiated household policy. Valeria ate macaroni and cheese that was made from scratch and was significantly better than it had any right to be, with bread that the bakery woman would have been pleased about. And she listened to Maya describe a conflict at school involving a disputed set of colored pencils with the kind of narrative detail and moral conviction that suggested a very clear sense of who had been wronged and why. "Were they your pencils originally?" Valeria asked when Maya paused for breath. "They were the class pencils, but I was using them." That's a complicated ownership situation. Maya considered this seriously. "Dad says the rule is whoever's using something gets to finish using it before someone else takes it. That's a reasonable rule." Caleb didn't think so. "Caleb sounds like someone who hasn't fully internalized the rule," Valeria said. Rowan, across the table, was looking at his food with the expression of someone working to maintain composure. "He has not," Maya agreed with deep conviction. After dinner, Maya went to a back room to finish her drawing project, which she described as a surprise and therefore could not be elaborated on. And Rowan made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the way people sit after a meal when no one is in a hurry to leave. Not really talking about anything important, just talking. He asked how the board meeting had gone. She gave him the actual answer rather than the summary, which took longer but felt more honest, and he listened in the attentive way he had that communicated he was actually processing what she was saying rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "The Hargrove thing," he said when she got to that part. "You let him realign without making it cost him." "Yes, that was a choice." "It was a practical choice," she said. "I needed his vote more than I needed his accountability for a crime he didn't technically commit." "Still," he said, "it was the harder thing to do." She thought about that. "It was the smarter thing to do." "Sometimes they're the same thing," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the warm light of a house that felt like somebody actually lived in it, and thought about all the things she'd done in the past 3 weeks, and all the things she was still figuring out how to do, and about the fact that she was sitting here at all, that a rainy airfield and a man with a flashlight and a child who grabbed phones had collectively redirected something in her that she hadn't known needed redirecting. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Sure." "I think I'd been running my company the way I'd learned to run myself, at a distance from the things that could hurt me." She said it slowly, finding it as she said it rather than delivering something she'd already prepared. Efficient systems and clear metrics, and enough removed that when something went wrong I could analyze it rather than feel it. She looked at her coffee. "It worked for a long time. It's part of how I built the thing. But somewhere in the building of it, the remove became the default. Not a strategy anymore, just how I was." He didn't say anything. Let her finish. "The sabotage happened in the space that the remove created," she said. "Griffin couldn't have done what he did in a company where the CEO was genuinely close enough to the people in it to notice who was unhappy and why and what they might do about it." She paused. "I'm not blaming myself for what he chose. That was his choice. But I created conditions where it was easier." "You're being hard on yourself," he said. "I'm being accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment, then, "My father used to say that the most dangerous thing on an aircraft isn't a broken part. It's a broken part that looks fine, the kind that passes the inspection because it's doing everything it's supposed to do except the one thing that matters." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "People can be like that too. Griffin passed every inspection you ran." "I know." "That's not on you," he said. "What's on you is whether you change the inspection." She sat with that. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her across all their conversations, the most explicitly advisory, the most willing to step out of the careful professional courtesy he'd been maintaining and just say the thing. She appreciated it. She also noticed that he'd done it in a way that left her agency intact. "What's on you is whether you change the inspection, not you should change the inspection. Still just an observation, still her call." "I'm changing the inspection," she said. "I know." And he said it with the same simple certainty with which she'd said, "I will find out who did it," on the night of the airfield, standing in a borrowed jacket that smelled like motor oil. Not flattery, just a thing he'd assessed and found to be true. Maya reappeared from the hallway carrying a piece of paper with the careful formality of someone presenting something they'd worked on and were invested in the reception of. She stopped in the doorway. "It's done," she said. "Let's see," Rowan said. She came to the table and put the drawing down between them. It was done in crayon with the specific confidence of a child who hadn't yet learned to be tentative about art. Bold colors, figures that were more suggested than rendered, but unmistakably a scene. 2 figures standing next to a very large object that was, with some interpretive generosity, an airplane. One figure was taller, in a yellow jacket that was Valeria's coat she understood with a start. The other was smaller, with gray markings around the eyes. Maya's approximation of her father. "That's you," Maya said, pointing to the yellow figure. "And that's Dad. And that's the plane Dad fixed." Valeria looked at the drawing for a moment. The 2 figures were standing next to each other, not apart. Maya had drawn their hands, crayon approximations, 4 fingers each, close together without quite touching. She didn't know if that was intentional or just the natural proximity of 2 figures in a small space, and it didn't particularly matter. "It's really good," Valeria said, and she meant it. "You can keep it," Maya said, with the generosity of someone giving away something valuable because they've decided the recipient is worthy of it.
Maya,
Rowan said quietly. She can keep it, Maya repeated to him in a tone that closed the discussion. Valeria took the drawing, held it for a moment, said thank you in a way that was genuine and didn't make a performance of it, which was, she thought, the only way to receive something like this correctly. She left at 8:30 because Maya needed to go to bed, and Rowan didn't say so, but she could read the hour. At the door, Maya gave her a hug that was brief and fierce and completely matter-of-fact, the hug of a child who had decided something and was confirming it physically, and then went inside without further ceremony. Rowan walked her to the porch. The November air was cold and clear, and the street was quiet. She's going to ask to come to your office at some point, he said. I'm giving you advance notice so you can prepare an excuse. I don't have an excuse. She can come. He looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. It was, she thought, the third or fourth time she'd said some version of that to him. I know I don't have to. I know. Like each time she had to reassure him that the thing she was offering was chosen rather than obligated. She understood where that came from. A man who'd been doing everything himself for 4 years, who'd built a life on not asking for more than what was given, who had learned to interpret generosity as something that needed to be verified. She didn't find it frustrating. She found it, in some complicated way, one of the more honest things about him. She'd like it, Valeria said. Bring her sometime. He nodded. She walked down the porch steps toward her car, and at the bottom she stopped and turned back because there was one thing she hadn't said, and it had been waiting. Rowan. He was still standing on the porch, looking at her with the patient attention he brought to everything. That night on the airfield, she said, you didn't know what was at stake. You just looked at the plane. Yeah. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She held his gaze in the cold air. You didn't need to know the stakes to do the right thing. Most people need the stakes. They need to understand what's in it for them, or what they're preventing, or what they'll be credited with. You just looked, because looking was the right thing to do. He was quiet for a moment. My father looked like that, he said, at everything. Aircraft, problems, people. He said if you look at something correctly, you don't need to know what it costs to do the right thing. The correct thing is usually just visible. She thought about that. About a man she'd never met who had taught his son to look at the world a certain way, and about the specific chain of events that had ended with that son standing on a wet tarmac at the right moment with the right quality of attention. Well, she said, it saved my life. I want you to know I understand that, even if I don't always say it. He didn't answer immediately, the kind of pause that wasn't awkward but was doing something, absorbing the weight of what had been said without deflecting it. Get home safe, he said finally, simply. Good night, Rowan. She drove home through the clear November dark, and on the passenger seat beside her was a crayon drawing of 2 people standing next to a plane. She didn't put it in her bag. She left it on the seat where she could glance at it at red lights. The yellow-jacketed figure and the gray-eyed one standing close together in the bold, unambiguous lines of a child who hadn't learned yet to hedge her depictions of the world. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved the way legal processes do. Slowly, with frequent procedural pauses that were maddening if you let yourself focus on them. Griffin Lowell entered a cooperation agreement with the criminal process that was expected to result in charges carrying real consequences. Soren Bale, the IT contractor, faced a separate charge set that reflected his more limited but still deliberate role. Dessa Kimball was not criminally charged because her emails, even the worst of them, stopped short of the explicit instruction threshold that criminal conspiracy required, but the civil process was another matter, and her professional reputation was in a condition that she would spend years attempting to recover. Hargrove resigned from the board in January, citing personal reasons. It was a quiet exit. She didn't pursue what she could have pursued because it would have cost more than it returned, and she was trying to stop being the kind of leader who spent energy on punishing rather than building. The Geneva partnership was finalized in December, in a meeting that happened in person this time. She'd made the trip, same departure window, same airfield, and she'd stood on the tarmac before boarding the replacement aircraft and looked at it the way she'd seen Rowan look at aircraft, not checking for specific things, just looking. reading the physical reality of it before she trusted the instruments. The flight was uneventful. She slept most of it, which she almost never did on flights. She landed in Geneva and had the meeting she'd been planning for months, and came home with a signed framework agreement that would expand Cross-Arrow's infrastructure reach by 40% over the next 3 years. She stood at the window of her office on the afternoon she came back and looked at the city and thought about what it had cost to get to that afternoon. Not just the sabotage and the investigation and the board confrontation, but all of it. The 10 years of building, the choices she'd made and the ones she'd avoided, the things she'd been too busy to look at, and the things she'd seen clearly, and the things she'd chosen not to see. She thought about all the people along the way who had been quietly doing the right thing without asking for the stakes to be established first, and how many of them she'd probably walked past without registering because she'd been looking at the instruments. She was trying not to do that anymore. She was trying to look at the aircraft. It was harder than it sounded. She was a systems person, a data person, and the habit of reading output rather than watching process was deep in how she worked. She caught herself doing it regularly, reaching for the report rather than the conversation, managing the metric rather than the person. When she caught it, she tried to correct, which was the best she could do. Real change didn't happen in a single decision. It happened in the accumulated correction of 100 smaller defaults, redirected slightly over time, until the new direction was the one that felt natural. She was working on it. Rowan's first week at Cross-Arrow was chaotic in the way that first weeks were chaotic. New systems, new faces, the specific overwhelm of inheriting a division that had been running under someone else's assumptions for 7 years. He called her twice that week with questions that he'd prefaced with, "Sorry to bother you," in a way she'd told him to stop doing on the second call. "You're not bothering me," she said. "That's what the direct reporting line is for." "I know, Rowan, you found a device in my airplane in the rain. You can call me about a compliance question." A pause that had a smile somewhere in it. "Okay. Also, how's Maya handling the new schedule?" "She made me a list," he said, "of things she wants to do with the extra time on the days I'm not on the early rotation. It's laminated." "She laminated it?" She found the laminator. He said it with the tone of a man who had decided to simply coexist with the force of nature that was his daughter. "It's on the refrigerator next to her drawings. Next to yours, actually." She thought about the crayon drawing on her passenger seat, which she'd moved to her desk at the office and then to the wall above her desk, in a spot where she could see it from her chair. 2 figures, a plane, bold, unambiguous lines. "Tell her the laminator was a good call," Valeria said. "She'll take that as an endorsement of the laminator in general. I want you to know the consequences of that." "I'll live with it." She put her phone down and looked at her calendar and looked at the drawing and looked at the city beyond her window, and she thought about all of it, the whole of it, from the rain-soaked airfield to this office on a December afternoon, from the moment she'd said let him through to the moment she'd said she can come. And she understood that the real thing that had happened over those weeks wasn't the investigation or the confrontation or the Geneva framework or the board restructuring. Those things had happened, and they mattered, and they were real. But the real thing, the thing underneath all of it, was simpler and harder than any of those. She'd learned to look at the aircraft, not perfectly, not consistently, not without regularly reverting to the old reflex of reading the instruments and trusting the report. But she was learning it, and she was learning it because a man in a grease-stained jacket on a wet tarmac had shown her what it looked like when you did it right. When you stepped back from all the noise and the data and the hierarchy of expertise and just looked at the thing itself with whatever quality of attention you genuinely had and let what was actually there be what was actually there. That was the lesson. Not the investigation, not the betrayal, not even the survival of it. The lesson was the look. The patient, undefended, non-instrumental act of seeing something as it was, rather than as the instruments reported it. She was 30 years old, and she'd built something real, and she'd nearly had it taken from her by people who knew her well enough to understand her vulnerabilities, and had decided that was acceptable. She'd come through the other side of it with 360 people still employed, and a partnership secured, and a board that was shakier but more honest than it had been a month ago. and she had a drawing on her wall of two people standing next to a plane made by a 6-year-old with her father's eyes, who had decided, in the bold and unbothered way of people who haven't yet learned to be tentative about these things, that Valeria was someone worth drawing into the picture. She didn't take it for granted. She'd learned in the hardest possible way that the things worth having were not the things that held themselves together without attention. They were the things that required you to keep looking, carefully and honestly, not just at the instruments, but at the aircraft itself, at the fastener that didn't match, at the person standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, at the question underneath the metrics. Some warnings came from the quietest places. If you weren't looking, you missed them. If you'd learned finally to look, they could save everything that mattered. She had learned to look. That was enough to start with.